They sent a private army to assassinate a politician. They didn't know she hired an army of her own. The Shadowboxer. Chapter 1. Rain blew off the Potomac in horizontal sheets, hammering the brick facade of the Georgetown townhouse. Brill Wingfield stood in the alleyway, the water shedding off his dark slicker, and studied the rear entrance. The security setup cost more than a standard suburban home. A reinforced steel door, wrapped in mahogany veneer. A hard-wired DSC neo-intrusion panel. 2 exterior infrared cameras cross-covering the threshold, feeding a closed-loop server in the basement. It looked impenetrable on paper. In the physical world, it was an illusion sold to people with too much money and not enough imagination. Brill stepped into the blind spot beneath the left camera housing. He reached up, tapped a localized signal jammer the size of a matchbox to the coaxial line, and scrambled the feed. He had a 60-second loop. He dropped to a crouch before the door. He ignored the digital keypad and focused on the Medeco biaxial deadbolt. He withdrew 2 slivers of spring steel from his pocket. Tension wrench in the bottom of the keyway. Rake pick sliding over the angled pins. He felt the minute shift in the cylinder, the microscopic click of brass clearing the shear line. He applied rotational force. The deadbolt snapped back. Brill pushed the door open, slipping inside and closing it before the wind could alter the air pressure in the hallway. The townhouse smelled of lemon floor wax, old leather, and money. Brill shed his wet slicker, leaving it in a dark corner of the mudroom. He wore a matte black tactical sweater and soft-soled boots. He became part of the house. He moved down the corridor. He heard the low murmur of a television playing a late-night sports broadcast. The kitchen. Brill peered around the edge of the custom cabinetry. A man sat on a stool at the marble island, watching a tablet. He wore an unbuttoned suit jacket, a shoulder holster straining against a white dress shirt. Private security. Ex-cop, judging by the thickened waistline and the relaxed posture. He held a mug of coffee in his left hand. His right hand rested flat on the counter. Brill stepped into the kitchen. He crossed the tile floor without a sound. He brought his left arm around the man's throat, locking the crook of his elbow directly over the Adam's apple. At the same instant, Brill drove his right knee into the base of the man's spine and clamped his right hand over the back of the guard's skull, forcing his chin down into his chest. The guard dropped the coffee mug. It shattered on the marble. Brill tightened the carotid restraint, cutting off blood flow to the brain. The man thrashed for 3 seconds, his hands clawing uselessly at Brill's thick forearm. Then the resistance vanished. The guard went limp. Brill lowered the unconscious man to the floor. He drew the Glock 19 from the man's shoulder holster and slipped it into his waistband. 1 down. The perimeter schematic showed a second guard stationed at the top of the main staircase. Brill navigated the shadows of the living room, bypassing antique rugs and glass coffee tables. He reached the base of the stairs. The second guard stood on the landing, staring down at his phone. The blue light illuminated a younger face, tight jaw, military haircut. More alert than the first man, but distracted by a screen. Brill took the carpeted stairs 2 at a time, staying close to the wall where the wood groaned less under pressure. He reached the landing before the guard looked up. Brill struck. He drove the heel of his palm into the guard's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in a sharp hiss. As the man folded forward, Brill pivoted, bringing the edge of his forearm down across the back of the man's neck, striking the vagus nerve. The guard dropped like a stone, folding into a heap on the expensive runner rug. Brill stripped a second Glock 19 from this man's hip. The master suite sat at the end of the hall. The door was unlocked. A critical failure. Brill entered the bedroom. The air in here carried a different texture. The sharp scent of ozone from the storm pressed against the heavy glass windows, mingling with the faint, expensive notes of Tom Ford Black Orchid perfume. Victoria Hayes slept in the center of a king-sized bed. She breathed in a shallow rhythmic cadence. Brill moved to a high-backed leather armchair situated in the dark corner of the room. He sat down. He placed the 2 captured Glocks on his lap. He worked entirely by touch, his fingers executing a sequence burned into muscle memory. He dropped the magazines. He racked the slides, ejecting the chambered rounds. They hit the carpet with dull thuds. He pulled the slide lock down, pushing the slide assembly forward off the frame. He compressed the recoil spring, removed the barrel. Using the edge of a magazine baseplate, he depressed the spacer sleeve, slid the plastic cover plate off the rear of the slide, and extracted the striker assembly. He removed the firing pins from both weapons. Small, insignificant pieces of steel. Without them, the guns were just expensive paperweights. He reassembled the empty slides, snapped them onto the frames, and set the useless weapons on the small table next to his chair. He rolled the 2 firing pins between his thumb and forefinger. He waited. The wind howled against the glass. 20 minutes passed. The rhythmic breathing from the bed hitched, broke, and then accelerated. Victoria Hayes woke up. She sat up in the darkness, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. She turned her head toward the corner. "Don't turn on the light," Brill said. His voice carried no inflection. It cut through the room like a physical object. Hayes froze. Her hand hovered an inch from the bedside lamp. Her pulse hammered a visible rhythm against the pale skin of her throat. She lowered her hand. She slid her other hand under her pillow. "The panic button routes to a private server in the basement," Brill told her. "I cut the hard line at the junction box. The cellular backup is experiencing severe localized interference. Pushing the button will make you feel better, but no one is coming." Hayes kept her hand under the pillow. She stared into the dark corner. "Who are you?" "I am the audit," Brill said. "I didn't authorize an audit." Her voice held a tremble, but she forced a layer of senatorial authority over it. A habit acquired from years of commanding committee hearings. It meant nothing in this room. "Your board of directors authorized it." Brill stood up. He stepped out of the deepest shadow, letting the ambient street light from the window illuminate his silhouette. "They wanted to know if Barracuda's new owner was secure. You aren't." "I have men downstairs," Hayes said. "You had men downstairs. One is asleep on your kitchen floor. The other is asleep on the landing." Brill walked to the edge of her bed. He tossed the 2 metal firing pins onto her mattress. They bounced off the silk. "They carried these. Now they don't." Hayes looked at the small metal rods. She understood what they were. The last remnants of her authority evaporated. She pulled her knees up to her chest, putting the blankets between them. "Are you Vanguard?" she asked. The tremor in her voice deepened. "If I were Vanguard, you would be dead in your sleep. They don't run audits." Brill looked down at her. "They sent the threat package to your office yesterday. 4 photographs of this house. 2 photographs of your daughter's dorm room in Boston. A demand for the Barack server drives." Hayes swallowed hard. "How do you know about the package?" "I read the file. The Secret Service detail is supposed to take over tomorrow. The Secret Service protects presidents and visiting dignitaries. They don't protect private defense contractors hoarding blackmail material on foreign governments. If they show up tomorrow, they aren't here to keep you alive. They are here to secure the drives for themselves." Brill checked his watch. "You have a problem, Senator." "I'm not a senator anymore." "You're a target," Brill said. "Vanguard won't send another letter. The next thing they send will be a breach team." Your rent-a-cops downstairs couldn't stop me. They won't stop professionals. Hayes looked at the firing pins resting on her sheets. She looked at the dark shape of the man standing over her. She recognized the cold, absolute truth in his posture. He wasn't negotiating. He was stating facts. "Can you stop them?" she asked. "Yes." "How much?" 200,000 in a bearer account to start. A wire transfer of 5 million when the threat is neutralized. Hayes didn't flinch at the number. She operated in a world where money solved problems. "Done." "When do we start?" "We already started." Brill turned and walked toward the bedroom door. "Put some clothes on. Dark colors. Nothing restrictive. Leave your phone, leave your smartwatch. If it requires a battery, leave it in the room." "Where are we going?" "Out the back door," Brill said. "Before the real wolves show up." He stepped into the hallway, leaving her alone in the dark to face the wreckage of her security. Chapter 2. 5 minutes later, Victoria Hayes emerged from the master suite. She wore charcoal slacks, a black cashmere turtleneck, and leather riding boots. The clothes belonged in a Georgetown coffee shop, not an extraction, but they offered mobility. Her hands trembled. She kept rubbing her palms against the expensive wool of her sweater. Brill Wingfield stood waiting in the corridor. He held out his left hand. "Everything with a battery or a signal," Brill said. Hayes reached into her pocket. She produced an iPhone, encased in a slim leather shell. She placed it in his palm. Brill dropped it onto the hardwood floor and drove the heel of his boot down. The glass screen shattered. The aluminum chassis snapped with a sharp, synthetic crunch. Hayes flinched. "That had my entire—" "Your wrist," Brill interrupted. She looked down at the Apple Watch secured by a rose gold band. She unclasped it and handed it over. Brill stepped on it. Another crunch of glass and circuitry. "The necklace," Brill said. He pointed to the thick diamond pendant resting against the black cashmere at her throat. "This is an antique. It belonged to my grandmother." "It's a housing," Brill said. "Thick enough to hold a passive RFID tag or a GPS micro-tracker. You run a black box defense firm, Senator. People want to know where you are. Take it off." Her jaw tightened. The politician flared up, a brief spark of defiance in the dark hallway. "You are being paranoid." "I am being thorough. Paranoia is guessing." "I don't guess." Hayes reached back, unfastened the clasp, and let the heavy diamond drop into his outstretched hand. Brill slipped it into his pocket. He would ditch it down a storm drain 3 blocks away. A low, heavy vibration shivered through the floorboards. The resonance of large engines displacing water on the street outside. Brill moved past her, silent on the runner rug. He reached the front bedroom, a guest suite overlooking the street. He pressed his back against the floral wallpaper beside the window. He peeled the edge of the heavy blackout curtain back a fraction of an inch. 3 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans idled at the curb. No headlights. No running lights. The rain washed over their armored plating. The doors of the lead vehicle opened. Men spilled onto the wet asphalt. They wore featureless black tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and ballistic helmets without insignia. They moved with the fluid, practiced economy of men who did this for a living. They carried short-barreled rifles equipped with suppressors and holographic sights. 2 men took the perimeter. 4 men advanced on the front door. 1 carried a kinetic breaching ram. Brill dropped the curtain. He gauged the timing. The heavy steel door downstairs would hold them for maybe 20 seconds. "Your new detail," Brill said. He stepped back into the hallway. Hayes moved toward the bedroom door, her eyes wide. "The Secret Service. Assassins wear whatever suits the occasion." Brill gripped her elbow. His fingers dug into the cashmere, a hard, unyielding pressure. "We are moving. Now." He steered her toward the rear staircase. They descended into the kitchen. The air smelled of spilled coffee and the metallic tang of ozone leaking in from the storm outside. The first guard still lay unconscious on the marble tile. Hayes stopped. Her boots skidded on the floor. She stared down at the man's limp arms, the unnatural angle of his neck. A sharp gasp hitched in her throat. She froze, a deer caught in the headlights of sudden, brutal violence. "Keep moving," Brill said. He didn't offer comfort. He applied forward pressure to her arm, forcing her to step over the man's legs. "Is he dead?" she whispered. "He's breathing. Focus on your feet." They reached the pantry. Brill shoved aside a rack of imported olive oils and opened the heavy, fire-rated door leading to the basement. A thunderous crash shook the house above them. The kinetic ram striking the front door. The sound echoed down the stairwell, a massive shockwave of displaced air and splintering wood. The steel frame held, but the structural studs around it groaned. "Go," Brill ordered. He shoved her onto the wooden stairs leading down into the dark. He followed, pulling the heavy fire door shut behind them, throwing the deadbolt. It bought them another 10 seconds. The basement hummed. Racks of black servers lined the far wall, their cooling fans generating a steady industrial drone. A wall-mounted air conditioning unit pumped frigid air into the concrete room, fighting the heat of the processors. This was the brain of Barack. Terabytes of raw, unredacted intelligence. Blackmail. Another crash from upstairs. A tearing sound. The front door gave way. Heavy boots hit the hardwood floor of the foyer. Voices barked sharp, clipped commands. "Clear right. Move, move." Hayes backed against the cold concrete wall. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting between the ceiling and Brill. Brill didn't look up. He unzipped a nylon pouch on his tactical rig. He withdrew a metallic cylinder the size of a coffee can. It consisted of a machined aluminum core wrapped in hundreds of coils of thick copper wire, capped with a digital timer and a small block of C4. An explosively pumped flux compression generator. A localized electromagnetic pulse. Brill set the cylinder on top of the primary server rack. He armed the detonator. A red light blinked on the timer. 10 seconds. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He grabbed Hayes by the shoulder of her sweater, hauling her toward the rear of the basement. A heavy set of steel storm doors angled up toward the alleyway. "Open your mouth," Brill said. He threw the heavy iron latch on the storm doors. "Cover your ears." "What?" she stammered, the panic finally breaking through her senatorial veneer. Brill didn't repeat himself. He shoved her up the concrete steps. He pushed the storm doors open. The wind and rain whipped into the basement, instantly soaking them. Upstairs, the heavy footsteps reached the kitchen. Someone kicked the pantry door. Brill pulled Hayes up into the alleyway. The brick walls on either side formed a narrow trash-strewn canyon. He hit the remote detonator clipped to his belt. Down in the basement, the generator fired. It wasn't a massive explosion. It sounded like a massive, sharp crack of thunder confined within a tin can, followed by a bright blue flash of ionized air that spilled out from the open storm doors. Then absolute profound silence. The steady hum of the servers died instantly. The air conditioning unit ground to a halt. The ambient glow of the city grid reflecting in the puddles vanished as the townhouse went completely black. The EMP surge radiated outward in a 50-yard sphere. Inside the house, the tactical team's encrypted radios turned into dead plastic. Their holographic weapon sights blanked out. Their night vision goggles fried, plunging them into total darkness. Out on the street, the microprocessors in the 3 idling Suburbans fused The heavy engines choked and died. The electronic locks froze. Brill pulled the steel storm doors shut, sealing the basement. He locked his hand around Hayes's wrist. Her skin was freezing. "Walk," he said. "I can't see anything," she gasped, stumbling over a swollen garbage bag. The rain plastered her hair to her face. She shivered violently, the cold and the adrenaline finally taking their toll. Brill let go of her wrist. He grabbed the fabric of her collar, keeping her upright. He became her eyes, guiding her through the black alley. He didn't need light. He knew the layout of the block. He knew the placement of the dumpsters, the slick patches of wet cobblestone, the exact distance to the main avenue. He moved with a predatory grace, finding traction where Hayes found only slick mud. "They'll follow us," she panted. "They are blind," Brill said. "Their comms are dead. Their vehicles are bricks. By the time they establish a perimeter, we won't be in this zip code." They reached the end of the alley. The street lamps on the avenue cast long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. Brill stopped at the edge of the brick wall. He scanned the street. Empty. A lone taxi sped past, throwing a sheet of dirty water into the gutter. "You are a package now," Brill told her, the rain shedding off his dark sweater. "You don't make decisions. You don't ask questions. You do exactly what I tell you, the second I tell you to do it. Do you understand?" Hayes stared at him. The man standing beside her wasn't a bodyguard. He was a force of nature, as cold and indifferent as the storm beating down on them. She nodded once. "Good." Brill stepped out into the rain. "Keep up." He walked away, stepping into the shadows of the city. Victoria Hayes hurried after him, a woman who used to control empires, now reduced to following a ghost through the dark. Chapter 3. The rain did not stop. It drove down in hard, diagonal slants, bouncing off the pavement and filling the gutters of the side streets. Brill moved with purpose, a steady, ground-eating stride. Victoria Hayes struggled to match his pace, her riding boots slipping on the slick concrete. She was breathing hard, a harsh, ragged sound in the quiet dark. He did not slow down. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice a thin, wet rasp. Brill didn't answer. He turned right at the next intersection, checking his 6 o'clock. The street behind them was empty. The EMP had bought them a head start, a window of chaos. The vanguard team would have to coordinate without comms, establish a perimeter without vehicles, and navigate without light. A good team would take 5 minutes. A great team would take 3. He operated on the assumption they had 2. They reached a narrow alleyway wedged between a dry cleaner and a defunct bodega. Brill stopped, pressing Hayes back against the damp brick. He peered around the corner. An older model sedan, a dark blue Ford Taurus, sat parked under a flickering halogen street lamp halfway down the block. "Wait here," Brill said. He didn't wait for her acknowledgement. He crossed the wet street, staying low, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He reached the driver's side of the Taurus. He didn't bother with lockpicks. Time was the enemy now. He wrapped his hand in the thick fabric of his wet sweater and drove his elbow into the side window, aiming for the lower corner where the tempered glass was weakest. The glass shattered with a dull, muffled crump, holding its shape until he pushed his fist through the webbing and cleared the frame. He reached in, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. He reached under the steering column, his fingers finding the plastic casing. He yanked it free, exposing the wiring harness. He selected 2 wires, stripped the insulation with his thumbnail, and touched the exposed copper together. The starter motor whined, caught, and the engine rumbled to life. A low, steady vibration. Analog. Unhackable. He threw the car into drive and rolled it to the mouth of the alley. He kicked the passenger door open. "Get in," he said. Hayes scrambled into the front seat, pulling her wet coat around her. She was shivering violently now, her teeth clicking together. Brill leaned over, grabbed the door handle, and yanked it shut. "Put your head between your knees," Brill ordered. "Do not look out the window." She didn't argue. She folded herself forward, burying her face in her arms. Brill pulled the Taurus out onto the avenue. He didn't turn on the headlights. He drove by the ambient glow of the city lights reflecting off the wet asphalt, a dark shape moving through the storm. He kept the speed precise, a steady 35 miles per hour. Not fast enough to draw the attention of a passing patrol car, not slow enough to look hesitant. He watched the rearview mirror. "The men at the house," Hayes said, her voice muffled against her knees. "Who were they?" "Professionals," Brill said. "Private military contractors. Most likely hired through a shell company to give Vanguard plausible deniability. If they kill you, it looks like a robbery gone wrong or a kidnapping. If they get caught, they don't exist." "They wanted the drives," she said. "Yes." "I don't even know what's on them," Hayes confessed, the words spilling out in a rapid, panicky rush. "I bought Barack for its predictive analytics software. The intelligence division was supposed to be a secondary asset." "It's the only asset that matters," Brill said. He watched a pair of headlights turn onto the avenue 2 blocks behind them. They moved too fast. Too aggressive. The software is a toy. The intelligence division holds leverage. Secrets. That's what people kill for. He turned left onto a wider thoroughfare, heading toward the industrial district on the edge of the city. He engaged the headlights. The twin beams cut through the rain, illuminating the desolate stretch of warehouses and chain-link fences. The headlights in the rearview mirror turned with him. The distance between them closed rapidly. "We have company," Brill said. Hayes bolted upright, turning her head toward the rear window. "I told you to keep your head down," Brill snapped. His voice didn't rise in volume, but the authority behind it was absolute. She flinched and ducked back down. "Are they going to shoot?" "Not here," Brill said. "They want the drives. They can't interrogate a corpse." He accelerated. The Taurus responded with a sluggish whine, the older engine struggling against the sudden demand. In the mirror, the trailing vehicle, a sleek black SUV, surged forward, eating up the distance. Brill didn't try to outrun them. He couldn't. The Taurus was outclassed. He needed a different, tactical advantage. He needed an environment he could control. He spotted a gap in the concrete barriers lining a construction site on the right side of the road. He wrenched the steering wheel hard. The Taurus fishtailed on the wet pavement, the rear tires breaking traction before biting into the dirt and gravel of the construction site. The SUV followed, turning sharper, tighter, its heavy suspension absorbing the impact of the curb. Brill drove deep into the site, navigating through a maze of stacked steel I-beams, concrete pylons, and heavy earth-moving equipment. The mud sucked at the tires. The headlights bounced wildly, casting erratic shadows against the towering structures. He checked the mirror. The SUV was 10 yards behind him. Closing. He found what he was looking for, a narrow corridor between a row of metal shipping containers and a massive, tracked excavator. The passage was barely wide enough for the Taurus. Brill gunned the engine, forcing the car into the gap. The metal sides of the container shrieked against the passenger door, tearing a long, jagged strip of paint from the chassis. Hayes screamed, covering her ears against the noise. They cleared the corridor and emerged into a small clearing surrounded by concrete walls. A dead end. Brill slammed on the brakes. The Taurus slid through the mud, coming to a halt inches from the far wall. He killed the headlights. "Stay here," Brill commanded. "Keep your head down. If I do not come back in 2 minutes, get out and run." He grabbed the captured Glock 19 from the passenger seat, racked the slide, and stepped out of the car. He moved instantly, melting into the deep shadow cast by the excavator. He heard the heavy growl of the SUV's engine before he saw it. The black vehicle nosed into the narrow corridor between the containers, its headlights cutting a stark, brilliant path through the rain. It slowed, the driver cautious, scanning the clearing ahead. Brill didn't wait for them to fully emerge. He stepped out from the shadow of the excavator, leveling the Glock. He didn't aim for the men inside the armored cabin. He aimed lower. He squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. Crack. Crack. The 9mm hollow points punched through the thin metal of the SUV's front grille, directly below the glowing headlights. They found the radiator. A cloud of thick white steam erupted from the engine block, hissing violently as the pressurized coolant met the cold rain. The SUV ground to a halt, the engine choking and sputtering as the temperature spiked. The doors flew open. 2 men piled out, weapons raised. "Contact front," one yelled. Brill was already gone. He had shifted his position, moving laterally behind a stack of concrete pipes. He assessed the targets. Both men wore the same sterile black gear as the breach team. They moved with discipline, seeking cover, their rifles sweeping the dark clearing. They were blind in the darkness, their night vision useless against the sudden blinding glare of their own headlights reflecting off the steam. Brill took aim at the man on the left. He fired a single shot. The bullet struck the man's rifle, shattering the polymer lower receiver and sending the weapon spinning into the mud. The man cursed, dropping to one knee, reaching for a sidearm. Brill shifted his aim to the second man. He fired again. The shot caught the man in the upper thigh, just below the edge of his Kevlar vest. The man went down hard, a sharp grunt of pain escaping his lips. He hit the mud and stayed there, clutching his leg. Brill stepped out from behind the pipes. He walked toward the smoking SUV, the Glock held in a low, ready position. The man with the shattered rifle froze, his hand hovering over his holster. He saw Brill emerging from the shadows, a dark, silent shape. He saw the cold, detached efficiency in the man's posture. He slowly raised his hands, stepping back from his wounded partner. Brill stopped 5 feet away. He looked at the wounded man on the ground, then at the man with his hands in the air. "Tell your employer," Brill said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The audit failed. He didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on them and walked back to the Taurus. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and threw it into reverse. He backed the car out of the clearing, the ruined passenger side scraping against the shipping container once more. Hayes was sitting upright, staring at him, her eyes wide, reflecting the ambient light. "You didn't kill them," she whispered, the disbelief clear in her voice. Brill threw the car into drive and pulled out of the construction site, back onto the wet, deserted avenue. "Dead men tell no tales," Brill said, checking the mirror one last time. "But living men tell the right ones. They will go back. They will tell Vanguard what happened here. They will tell them that I am not a detail. I am a problem." He accelerated into the night. "And problems," Brill added quietly, "demand a different kind of respect." Chapter 4. The rain finally broke just before dawn, leaving the Baltimore Industrial District draped in a thick gray fog. Brill turned the battered Taurus down a service road lined with chain-link fencing and overgrown sumac. The road dead-ended at a massive, brutalist structure of poured concrete and corrugated steel. It looked like a forgotten monument to a dead industry. It was a decommissioned meatpacking plant. Brill had secured it 3 years ago through a blind trust. It was off the grid, structurally sound, and offered 3 avenues of escape. He parked the car inside a loading bay, hidden from street view by a rusted metal roll-down door. "Get out," he said, cutting the engine. Victoria Hayes stepped onto the cracked concrete of the loading dock. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline crash rendering her movements stiff and slow. Her cashmere sweater was damp and smelled of ozone and wet wool. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the damp chill of the morning air. Brill grabbed a canvas duffel bag from the trunk of the Taurus. He didn't offer to help her up the steps to the heavy steel entry door. He unlocked it with an iron key, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The interior was vast and cavernous. The smell hit immediately, a deep ingrained scent of rust, old concrete, and the faint coppery ghost of dried blood from decades past. Faded yellow lines marked forklift paths on the floor. Overhead, a network of heavy iron meat hooks hung suspended from thick steel rails, disappearing into the shadows of the high ceiling. Hayes stepped inside, her boots echoing loudly in the empty space. She stopped, staring up at the hooks. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as if afraid of waking something. "A defensible position," Brill said. He walked to a heavy breaker box on the wall and flipped 3 switches. A series of low-wattage work lights flickered on, casting harsh, uneven pools of yellow light across the floor. They illuminated a small area in the center of the room that had been converted into a Spartan living space. A military cot. A folding metal table. 2 folding chairs. A pallet of bottled water and MREs. "Sit," Brill ordered, pointing to one of the folding chairs. Hayes walked to the chair and sat down heavily. She pulled her knees together, trying to conserve heat. She watched Brill as he moved around the perimeter of the room. He was not resting. He was working. He opened the canvas duffel bag. He withdrew several spools of thin, high-tensile wire and a handful of small, metallic devices that looked like oversized shotgun shells. He moved to the large, industrial windows that lined the upper tier of the wall. They were painted black, preventing light from spilling out, but they were a vulnerability. Brill began stringing the wire across the windowsills, anchoring the ends to the concrete frame. He attached the metallic devices to the wire. "Trip flares?" she asked, recognizing the mechanism from her time on the Armed Services Committee. "Analog," Brill said, twisting a wire taut. "No frequency to jam. No battery to die. If someone breaches the window, the wire pulls the pin. The flare burns at 3,000 degrees. It blinds night vision and sets the immediate area on fire." He finished the first window and moved to the next. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm. "You're expecting them," she said. "I am preparing for them," Brill corrected. "There is a difference. Expectation is passive. Preparation is active." He moved to the heavy steel door they had just entered. He took a small bottle from his pocket. It looked like eye drops. He unscrewed the cap and sprinkled a line of fine white powder across the threshold. "Crushed glass," he explained, noting her confused expression. "It crunches under a boot. A silencer hides the muzzle blast, but it doesn't hide the sound of a man walking on broken glass." Hayes watched him. The realization of her situation settled over her, cold and heavy. The power she wielded in Washington, the ability to summon cabinet secretaries, command media cycles, direct billions in funding, was entirely useless in this concrete room. Her wealth had bought her the man stringing tripwire, but it couldn't buy her safety. "Who are they?" she asked again. "You said Vanguard. Is that a government agency? A contractor?" Brill finished the threshold and walked back to the metal table. He pulled a bottle of water from the pallet, cracked the seal, and set it on the table in front of her. "Drink," he said. She picked up the bottle with trembling hands and took a long swallow. The water was lukewarm and tasted of plastic, but it helped clear the dry scrape in her throat. "Vanguard is a splinter," Brill said, taking the chair opposite her. He didn't lean back. He sat forward, his posture alert, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. "They started as a black book intelligence gathering unit, operating under the DIA. Tasked with domestic surveillance. Counter-terrorism. The usual mandate. I never saw their budget, Hayes said. Because they don't have one, Brill replied. They went rogue 5 years ago. They realized that gathering intelligence for the government paid a salary, but holding intelligence over the government paid dividends. Blackmail, she whispered. Leverage, Brill corrected. They use the data to manipulate policy, secure defense contracts for shell companies, and ensure their own survival. They operate outside the law because they hold the secrets of the people who write the law. Hayes stared at the plastic bottle in her hands. And they think Barack has something they need. Barack developed a predictive algorithm designed to forecast geopolitical instability, Brill said. But to make the algorithm work, it needed data. Raw, unfiltered data. Your engineers didn't just scrape public databases. They bought access to foreign intelligence feeds. They hacked secure servers. They built a library of human weakness. I didn't authorize that. It doesn't matter what you authorized, Brill said, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. It matters what you own. You own the servers. Vanguard wants them. If they get the servers, they own Washington. If you refuse to give them the drives, they will kill you to remove the obstacle. So we hide, she said, looking around the cavernous room. No, Brill said. We don't hide. He stood up. He walked to the canvas duffel bag and pulled out a matte black rifle. It was a customized HK-416, fitted with a suppressor, a variable optic, and a laser aiming module. He checked the action, dropping the magazine, racking the charging handle, inspecting the chamber. The metallic clack-clack of the weapon echoed loudly in the quiet room. Hiding is a delay tactic, Brill said, seating a fresh magazine with a solid thwack. It gives the enemy time to consolidate resources. It gives them the initiative. Then what are we doing here? We are forcing a mistake, Brill said. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and picked up a pair of binoculars. He walked toward a set of rusted metal stairs leading to an elevated catwalk that ran along the far wall. The men I engaged at the construction site, Brill continued, his boots ringing on the metal grate of the stairs. They will report back. They will describe my tactics. Vanguard will realize they are not dealing with private security. They will escalate. They will send a dedicated, wet work team. He reached the catwalk. He moved to a narrow ventilation slit cut into the concrete wall overlooking the service road. He raised the binoculars to his eyes. I left a breadcrumb, Brill said softly, adjusting the focus. A digital ping from the Taurus's navigation system before I ripped the wiring harness out. A very faint signal. Hard to find, but Vanguard has the resources to find it. They will trace it to a cell tower 2 miles from here. Hayes stood up from the chair. She walked to the base of the stairs, staring up at him in horror. You led them here, she asked, her voice shrill, the panic returning. You invited them? Brill didn't lower the binoculars. He watched the gray fog rolling over the chain-link fence. I didn't invite them, Brill said, his voice calm, steady, and utterly lethal. I chose the ground. They are hunting a politician. They expect a frightened woman hiding behind locked doors. He lowered the binoculars and looked down at her. They are going to find me instead. Chapter 5. The fog thickened as the day wore on, turning the afternoon into a bruised gray twilight. Inside the meatpacking plant, the temperature dropped. Brill Wingfield didn't build a fire. A fire meant smoke. Smoke meant a thermal signature. He sat on a rusted metal staircase halfway up the wall, his HK-416 resting across his knees. He had a clear sight line of the ground floor, the main entrance, and the catwalks above. He remained perfectly still, a shadow among shadows. Victoria Hayes sat wrapped in a coarse wool blanket at the folding table below. She had spent the last 8 hours staring at the concrete walls, the reality of her isolation sinking in. She had no phone, no staff, no power. She was a liability to be managed. At 0245 hours, the first trip flare ignited. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a vicious, blinding hiss of white phosphorus that erupted outside the high windows on the east wall. The light flared with the intensity of a dying sun, casting stark, jagged shadows across the factory floor. "Get in the locker," Brill said. His voice was a low murmur, but it carried perfectly in the sudden, sharp silence that followed the flare's ignition. Hayes didn't hesitate. Brill had instructed her earlier. She scrambled out of the chair, dropping the blanket, and climbed into an industrial metal storage locker they had dragged beneath the stairwell. She pulled the heavy door shut, leaving it cracked a fraction of an inch to breathe. Brill didn't move. He lowered his night vision goggles over his eyes. The world shifted into a crisp, monochromatic green. The harsh glare of the phosphorus flare outside washed out the upper windows, but the ground floor remained in deep shadow. He waited. The vanguard team wouldn't come through the window where the flare ignited. The flare was a distraction, or perhaps a clumsy mistake by a point man. A professional team would adapt. They would seek a secondary breach point, one not bathed in 3,000 degrees of light. A faint, rhythmic scraping sounded against the corrugated steel of the roof. Repelling lines. They were coming from above. Brill raised the barrel of the HK-416, tracking the sound. He sighted on the large, industrial skylight situated in the center of the vaulted ceiling. The glass was painted black from the inside, matching the windows. A heavy, muffled thump echoed through the plant, boots hitting the roof right above the skylight. Then, a sudden blinding flash of white light directly overhead. They were using a breaching charge, but a specialized one, a silent thermal cutter designed to melt through the steel framing of the skylight without the concussive blast of C4. The glass shattered inward, raining down in a cascade of sharp green daggers in Brill's night vision. 4 men dropped through the opening, descending on thick nylon ropes. They wore matte black tactical gear, suppressed submachine guns slung across their chests, and panoramic night vision goggles that gave them the appearance of multi-eyed insects. They hit the ground floor simultaneously, their boots landing on the concrete with practiced silent grace. They unclipped from their ropes in unison, fanning out into a diamond formation, sweeping the room with invisible infrared lasers. They were fast. They were silent. They were very, very good. But they hadn't seen the crushed glass. The point man stepped forward, moving toward the folding table where Hayes had been sitting seconds before. His boot came down on the fine white powder Brill had sprinkled across the floor. Crunch. It was a microscopic sound, barely audible over the hiss of the dying flare outside. But in the cathedral-like silence of the factory, it was as loud as a gunshot. The point man froze. He looked down at his boot. In that fraction of a second, Brill fired. He didn't aim for center mass. Center mass was protected by level 4 ceramic plates. He aimed for the weak points in the armor geometry. The HK-416 coughed softly, a muffled PFFT through the suppressor. The point man's left kneecap shattered into bone dust and shrapnel. The man let out a high, ragged shriek, his leg collapsing under him. He went down hard, his submachine gun clattering against the concrete. The remaining 3 men reacted instantly. They didn't panic. They didn't spray the room with blind fire. They pivoted toward the source of the muzzle flash, the rusted staircase halfway up the wall, and laid down a precise, concentrated volley of suppressed fire. Sparks flew as 9mm rounds sparked against the iron railing of the stairs, whining as they ricocheted off the steel framing. Brill was already gone. He had fired and immediately dropped flat on his stomach, sliding backward off the stairs and dropping 10 feet to the ground floor, landing in a crouch behind a massive cast-iron rendering vat. Contact right. Elevated, the team leader barked, his voice tight, disciplined. Suppressing. They poured fire into the empty staircase. The wounded point man writhed on the floor, screaming, his hands clutching the ruined mess of his knee. The sound was terrible, a raw animal noise of pure agony. Brill used the screaming. It covered his movements. He flanked them, moving silently in a wide arc behind the rendering vats, staying low to the ground. The vanguard team was focused on the stairs, their infrared lasers crisscrossing the empty air. They were highly trained, but they were trained to fight an enemy who held a position. They weren't trained to fight a ghost. Brill emerged from the shadows 10 feet behind the rear guard. The man was focused forward, providing cover for his team leader. He never heard Brill approach. Brill raised the HK-416. He aimed at the exposed gap between the man's ballistic helmet and the collar of his tactical vest. The brain stem peefed. The rear guard went limp instantly, his weapon slipping from his hands. He dropped straight down, a dead weight hitting the concrete with a heavy thud. The team leader heard the drop. He spun around, his weapon coming up, his night vision scanning the darkness. Viper 3 is down. We are flanked. He spotted Brill's silhouette for a fraction of a second. He fired a 3-round burst. The rounds chewed into the cast-iron rendering vat, inches from Brill's face, showering him with rust flakes. Brill didn't retreat. He advanced. He stepped out from cover, moving deliberately, smoothly, bringing the HK-416 to bear. The team leader and the remaining operative tracked him, their lasers painting his chest. Brill fired twice, a tight double tap. He hit the remaining operative in the throat. The man grabbed his neck, a wet gurgling sound escaping his lips as he fell backward, blood spraying in a dark arterial mist. It was just Brill and the team leader now. The point man on the floor was still screaming, thrashing in a pool of his own blood. The team leader realized his numerical advantage was gone. He realized his position was compromised. He realized he was outmatched. He stopped firing. He raised his hands, dropping his weapon to the floor. "Hold fire," the team leader yelled, his voice cracking. "I surrender." Brill stopped walking. He stood 10 feet away, the HK-416 leveled at the man's chest. The green glow of the night vision painted the team leader's terrified face. Inside the metal locker, Victoria Hayes covered her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, trembling uncontrollably as she listened to the brief, violent slaughter. The screaming of the point man echoed in her skull. Brill didn't lower his weapon. He looked at the team leader, his face hidden behind his own goggles. "Get on your knees," Brill said. His voice was cold, flat, entirely devoid of adrenaline. The team leader dropped to his knees, his hands clasped behind his head. Brill walked past him. He walked over to the screaming point man. The man was staring at his shattered knee, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. Brill pointed the HK-416 at the man's head and pulled the trigger. The screaming stopped instantly. The factory was suddenly very quiet, save for the hum of the distant city grid and the heavy, ragged breathing of the kneeling team leader. Brill turned back to the surviving man. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and drew a combat knife from a sheath on his chest rig. The blade was dark, non-reflective steel. "You surrendered," Brill said, walking slowly toward him. "That means you want to live." The team leader nodded frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. "Yes. I have intel. I'll tell you whatever you want." "I know," Brill said. He stopped in front of the kneeling man. "But first, we are going to make sure you don't run." He reached out, grabbed the man by the collar of his tactical vest, and hauled him toward the nearest structural pillar. Chapter 6. The team leader hung suspended from the structural pillar. Brill had used industrial zip ties, binding the man's wrists tight enough to compress the radial artery, but loose enough to maintain circulation. The man's toes barely brushed the concrete floor. He was breathing hard, a panicked rhythmic wheeze that echoed in the quiet factory. He was stripped of his tactical vest, his helmet, and his weapons. He was just a man in a black combat shirt, sweating profusely in the cold air. Victoria Hayes stood 10 feet away, arms wrapped around herself. She had refused to stay in the locker. She watched Brill approach the suspended man. She had seen politicians destroy careers with a whispered word or a leaked document. She had never seen a man dismantled piece by piece. Brill didn't carry a weapon. He carried a pair of heavy, stainless steel medical shears he had pulled from the dead medic's kit. He stopped in front of the team leader. "Name," Brill said. His voice was a flat, unreadable surface. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his sweat-slick throat. "Viper 1. That's all you get. Name, rank, serial number. I know the drill." "You are a private contractor," Brill said. "You don't have a rank or a serial number. You have an employer. Who pays you?" "I don't know." The man tried to project a defiance, but his eyes darted nervously to the shears in Brill's hand. "It's a blind trust. Caymans. They give us a target package, we execute, we get paid." Brill raised the medical shears. They caught the dim, yellow light of the factory floor. The blades were thick, serrated, designed to cut through Kevlar and combat boots in a trauma situation. "You are operating domestically," Brill said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "You are targeting a high-profile civilian, a former United States senator. That requires a specific mandate, a specific clearance. The kind of clearance a blind trust in the Caymans cannot provide." "Who is the handler?" "I told you, I don't." Brill didn't let him finish. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stepped forward, grabbed the man's left hand, and clamped the heavy shears over the tip of his left index finger. The man froze. His breath hitched in his throat. "The human hand has 27 bones," Brill said quietly. 14 of them are in the phalanges, the fingers. They contain an immense concentration of nerve endings. A trauma here is communicative." "Wait," the man gasped. The defiance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, visceral terror. "Who is the handler?" Brill asked. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes locked on the stainless steel blades. Brill squeezed the handles. The shears bit through skin, muscle, and bone with a sharp, wet crunch. The man screamed. It was a high, thin sound that tore from his throat, echoing off the high ceiling. He thrashed against the zip ties, his body convulsing in agony. Blood dripped steadily onto the concrete floor. Hayes turned away, clapping a hand over her mouth, her stomach heaving. The sound of the bone breaking was something she would never unhear. Brill stood perfectly still. He let the man scream for exactly 10 seconds. Then he reached out and clamped his hand over the man's mouth, cutting off the noise. "I am going to ask the question again," Brill said softly, leaning in close. The smell of copper and sweat filled the air between them. "If you lie to me, or if you hesitate, we will move to the next finger. If we run out of fingers, we will move to the toes. Do you understand?" The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide, tears streaking through the grime on his face. He made a muffled sound of assent against Brill's palm. Brill removed his hand. "The handler," Brill said. "Vanguard," the man sobbed, his chest heaving as he tried to drag air into his lungs. "They call themselves Vanguard." "I know the organization," Brill said. "I want the name of the man who gave the order." "We don't get names," the man cried, his voice bordering on hysteria. We get a digital drop. Encrypted comms. The voice is always modulated. We never see a face. Brill raised the shears again. He moved toward the middle finger of the man's left hand. No, wait. Wait. The man twisted away, panic lending him strength. I don't have a name. But I know where the drop is. I know how they pass the intel. Brill paused. The shears hovered inches from the man's hand. Tell me. It's a dead drop. Digital. The man spoke rapidly, desperate to keep the blades away from his flesh. A secure server farm in Chicago. It looks like a corporate data center. Front company. But the sub-basement is off the grid. That's where the Vanguard nodes are. That's where the orders come from. What is the name of the front company? Apex Solutions. Downtown. The Loop. The man sagged against the zip ties, exhausted, broken. That's all I know. I swear to God, that's all I know. Please. Brill stared at the man for a long moment. He evaluated the physiological responses. The rapid pulse, the dilated pupils, the sheer unfiltered terror in the voice. The man wasn't lying. He had reached the bottom of his reservoir of information. Brill lowered the shears. I believe you, Brill said. He stepped back. He reached to his tactical rig and drew the suppressed Glock 19 he had taken from the townhouse in Georgetown. He raised the weapon, leveling the sights squarely between the team leader's eyes. Wait, the man whispered, staring down the black barrel. You said. I didn't say anything, Brill said. He pulled the trigger. Peefed. The 9mm round entered the man's skull, an inch above the bridge of his nose. The team leader's head snapped back. He slumped forward against the restraints, entirely dead before he realized what had happened. Brill lowered the weapon. He turned away from the body and looked at Victoria Hayes. She was staring at him, her face completely drained of color. She had witnessed violence before, from a safe distance, wrapped in the sterile language of collateral damage and acceptable losses. She had never seen it up close. She had never seen a man executed in cold blood. You killed him, she said, her voice a hollow whisper. He gave you what you wanted, and you killed him. He was an active threat, Brill said. He didn't offer justification. He didn't ask for understanding. He simply stated the tactical reality. If I left him alive, he would eventually break his restraints, or someone would find him. He would report our location, our heading, and my methods. I do not leave liabilities behind. He walked to the folding table and picked up the canvas duffel bag. We are moving, Brill said. To Chicago, she asked, her voice trembling. Yes. Brill zipped the bag shut. Vanguard expects us to run. They expect a defensive posture. We are going to change the paradigm. We are going to take the offensive. I can't do this, Hayes said, taking a step back. I can't live like this. The violence. The hiding. It's too much. Brill stopped. He looked at her, his dark eyes unblinking. You don't have a choice, Brill said. You stepped onto a battlefield the moment you bought Barack. You just didn't realize it until tonight. The men who want those drives will not stop. They will not negotiate. They will burn the world down to find you. He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder. I am your only option, Brill said. You can follow me, or you can stay here with the bodies. Make a decision. He turned and walked toward the heavy steel door. Victoria Hayes stood alone in the center of the factory floor. She looked at the dead men. She looked at the blood pooling on the concrete. She realized Brill was right. The world she knew was gone, replaced by a cold, violent reality she barely understood. She pulled her cashmere sweater tight against her chest and hurried after the ghost. Chapter 7. The Peterbilt rolled into the sprawling industrial outskirts of Chicago shortly before dawn. The rain had followed them, a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the city into a smudge of gray and sodium orange light. The trucker dropped them at a deserted truck stop near the Indiana border, accepting Brill's money with a nod and a promise to forget their faces. Brill led Victoria Hayes into the harsh glare of a 24-hour diner adjacent to the truck stop. It smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. He chose a booth in the back, facing the door. He didn't order food. He ordered a pot of coffee and asked the waitress for the local phone book. Hayes sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug absorbing the heat. She looked pale and fragile, the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She watched Brill flip through the yellow pages, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "We need a local asset," Brill said, finding what he was looking for. "Someone with access to the corporate registry. Someone who can get past the front desk of Apex Solutions without raising an alarm." "I have contacts in Chicago," Hayes offered, her voice barely a croak. "Financial backers. Campaign contributors. People who owe me favors." "People who owe you favors are a liability," Brill said, closing the phone book. "Favors are traded. Information is sold. If Vanguard is monitoring your network, and they are, reaching out to a known associate will flag our location instantly." "Then who?" "Someone who has already proven they can be compromised," Brill said. He took a sip of the black coffee. "Your former chief of staff." Hayes stiffened. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through her fatigue. "David. David is in Washington. He works for a lobbying firm now." "David is in Chicago," Brill corrected. "He took a consulting position with a private equity group 2 months ago. A group that specializes in hostile takeovers of mid-level tech firms. A group that, according to the Barack files I reviewed, is a known front for Vanguard financial operations." "That's impossible," Hayes said, shaking her head. "David was with me for 10 years. He ran my campaigns. He managed my office. He wouldn't work for the people trying to kill me." "He isn't working for the people trying to kill you," Brill said, his voice devoid of judgment. "He is working for the people who pay him. Loyalty in Washington is a transactional commodity. He sold his access to Vanguard. He is the Judas." "You're guessing." "I don't guess." Brill leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "When Vanguard sent the threat package to your office, they bypassed 3 levels of security. They knew the layout. They knew the duty roster of your private detail. They had inside information. Information only a handful of people possessed. David was one of them." Hayes looked down at her coffee mug. The betrayal hit her harder than the physical exhaustion. The world she had built, the network of influence and power, was unraveling, revealing a core of rot and deception. "If he is working for them," she said slowly, "why would he help us?" "He won't," Brill said. "But he will meet with you. He will think he is leading you into a trap. And he will bring Vanguard with him." "You want to use me as bait again," she said, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. "Yes. At the townhouse, I had a metal locker to hide in," she reminded him. "Where do I hide when Vanguard shows up in Chicago?" "You don't hide," Brill said. "You stand in plain sight." He stood up, dropping a $20 bill on the table. He walked to the payphone near the restrooms. He dropped a quarter into the slot, dialed a number from memory, and waited. Hayes watched him. The fear was returning, a cold, sharp edge in her chest. She was a politician. She understood risk assessment and calculated losses. But she was being asked to calculate her own survival against men who killed without hesitation. Brill returned to the booth 3 minutes later. "The meat is set," he said. "Union Station. The Great Hall. Noon." He agreed that quickly? "He agreed because I told him you were desperate," Brill said. "I told him you had the drives, and you wanted to negotiate a surrender. I told him you would only hand them over to someone you trusted. And he believed you." "He believed the desperation," Brill said. "People hear what they want to hear. Vanguard wants the drives. David wants his bonus. They will come." "And what do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You walk to the center of the Great Hall," Brill instructed, his tone shifting into the cold, precise cadence of a tactical briefing. "You carry a briefcase. You wait for David to approach. You do not look for me. You do not acknowledge me. When the shooting starts, you drop to the floor and you stay down." "When the shooting starts," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You can't take on an entire hit squad in a crowded train station." "I don't intend to," Brill said. He picked up his canvas duffel bag. "I intend to use the crowd. A crowd is an environment. A crowd is chaos. And chaos is my advantage." He turned and walked toward the exit, stepping out into the gray, freezing rain of the Chicago morning. Victoria Hayes followed him, a woman walking willingly into a crossfire, trusting her life to a ghost she barely knew. Chapter 8. The Peterbilt rolled into the sprawling industrial outskirts of Chicago shortly before dawn. The rain had followed them, a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the city into a smudge of gray and sodium orange light. The trucker dropped them at a deserted truck stop near the Indiana border, accepting Brill's money with a nod and a promise to forget their faces. Brill led Victoria Hayes into the harsh glare of a 24-hour diner adjacent to the truck stop. It smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. He chose a booth in the back, facing the door. He didn't order food. He ordered a pot of coffee and asked the waitress for the local phone book. Hayes sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug absorbing the heat. She looked pale and fragile, the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She watched Brill flip through the yellow pages, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "We need a local asset," Brill said, finding what he was looking for. "Someone with access to the corporate registry. Someone who can get past the front desk of Apex Solutions without raising an alarm." "I have contacts in Chicago," Hayes offered, her voice barely a croak. "Financial backers. Campaign contributors. People who owe me favors." "People who owe you favors are a liability," Brill said, closing the phone book. "Favors are traded. Information is sold. If Vanguard is monitoring your network, and they are, reaching out to a known associate will flag our location instantly." "Then who?" "Someone who has already proven they can be compromised," Brill said. He took a sip of the black coffee. "Your former chief of staff." Hayes stiffened. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through her fatigue. "David. David is in Washington. He works for a lobbying firm now." "David is in Chicago," Brill corrected. "He took a consulting position with a private equity group 2 months ago. A group that specializes in hostile takeovers of mid-level tech firms. A group that, according to the Barack files I reviewed, is a known front for Vanguard financial operations." "That's impossible," Hayes said, shaking her head. "David was with me for 10 years. He ran my campaigns. He managed my office. He wouldn't work for the people trying to kill me." "He isn't working for the people trying to kill you," Brill said, his voice devoid of judgment. "He is working for the people who pay him. Loyalty in Washington is a transactional commodity. He sold his access to Vanguard. He is the Judas." "You're guessing." "I don't guess," Brill leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. When Vanguard sent the threat package to your office, they bypassed 3 levels of security. They knew the layout. They knew the duty roster of your private detail. They had inside information. Information only a handful of people possessed. David was one of them. Hayes looked down at her coffee mug. The betrayal hit her harder than the physical exhaustion. The world she had built, the network of influence and power, was unraveling, revealing a core of rot and deception. If he is working for them, she said slowly, why would he help us? He won't, Brill said. But he will meet with you. He will think he is leading you into a trap. And he will bring Vanguard with him. You want to use me as bait again, she said, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. Yes. At the townhouse, I had a metal locker to hide in, she reminded him. Where do I hide when Vanguard shows up in Chicago? You don't hide, Brill said. You stand in plain sight. He stood up, dropping a $20 bill on the table. He walked to the payphone near the restrooms. He dropped a quarter into the slot, dialed a number from memory, and waited. Hayes watched him. The fear was returning, a cold, sharp edge in her chest. She was a politician. She understood risk assessment and calculated losses. But she was being asked to calculate her own survival against men who killed without hesitation. Brill returned to the booth 3 minutes later. The meat is set, he said. Union Station. The Great Hall. Noon. He agreed that quickly? He agreed because I told him you were desperate, Brill said. I told him you had the drives, and you wanted to negotiate a surrender. I told him you would only hand them over to someone you trusted. And he believed you. He believed the desperation, Brill said. People hear what they want to hear. Vanguard wants the drives. David wants his bonus. They will come. And what do I do? She asked, her voice trembling. You walk to the center of the Great Hall, Brill instructed, his tone shifting into the cold, precise cadence of a tactical briefing. You carry a briefcase. You wait for David to approach. You do not look for me. You do not acknowledge me. When the shooting starts, you drop to the floor and you stay down. When the shooting starts, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. You can't take on an entire hit squad in a crowded train station. I don't intend to, Brill said. He picked up his canvas duffel bag. I intend to use the crowd. A crowd is an environment. A crowd is chaos. And chaos is my advantage. He turned and walked toward the exit, stepping out into the gray, freezing rain of the Chicago morning. Victoria Hayes followed him, a woman walking willingly into a crossfire, trusting her life to a ghost she barely knew. Chapter 9. Union Station at noon was a cathedral of noise and motion. Thousands of commuters, tourists, and transients flowed across the vast marble expanse of the Great Hall, their footsteps creating a dull, continuous roar that echoed off the vaulted, gilded ceiling. Victoria Hayes walked into the center of the concourse. She carried a sleek, aluminum Halliburton briefcase she had purchased at a luggage kiosk an hour earlier. It was empty, save for a stack of yesterday's newspapers added for weight. She wore a gray trench coat over her cashmere sweater, blending into the sea of muted winter colors. She felt completely exposed. Every face in the crowd looked like a threat. Every sudden movement made her heart hammer against her ribs. She stopped near the large brass clock in the center of the hall, exactly where Brill had told her to stand. She checked her watch. 11:58. David arrived at exactly noon. She recognized his walk first, a brisk, purposeful stride, shoulders thrown back, a man accustomed to moving through the halls of power. He wore a tailored navy suit and a light blue tie. He looked exactly the same as he had 2 months ago when he managed her Senate office, except for the tight, nervous energy vibrating around his eyes. He didn't come alone. Hayes saw them immediately. 4 men, wearing heavy winter coats that didn't quite conceal the bulk underneath. They moved in a loose diamond formation, drifting through the crowd with practiced ease, maintaining a steady distance of 20 feet from David. Brill had been right. It was a trap. David stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the aluminum briefcase, then up at her face. The guilt was there, fleeting, immediately replaced by a hardened, transactional coldness. "Victoria," he said. His voice barely carried over the din of the station. "David." Her voice was remarkably steady. She channeled every ounce of political discipline she possessed. She didn't look at the men behind him. She didn't look for Brill. "You look tired," David observed. "It's been a long few days," she replied. "I brought what you asked for. The drives." David took a step closer, reaching for the handle of the briefcase. "Good. The people I represent are very eager to conclude this business. Before I give it to you," Hayes said, tightening her grip on the handle, "I need to know it's over. No more audits. No more threats." "It's over," David assured her, a slick practiced lie rolling off his tongue. "Once they've verified the data, you are free to go back to Washington." He reached for the case again. From the upper balcony overlooking the Great Hall, Brill Wingfield watched the interaction. He had identified the 4 Vanguard operatives the moment they entered the station. They were good, maintaining overlapping fields of fire, but they were constrained by the environment. They couldn't pull weapons in a crowded transit hub without triggering a massive panic and a police response. They needed a quiet extraction. Brill wasn't going to give them quiet. He held a small, remote detonator in his palm. He had spent the last hour planting 3 military-grade smoke grenades in strategic locations around the Great Hall, inside a hollowed-out trash receptacle, atop a newspaper stand, and tucked behind a structural pillar near the main escalators. David's hand touched the handle of the aluminum briefcase. Brill pressed the detonator. 3 sharp, muffled pops echoed through the station. Instantly, thick, blinding clouds of white phosphorus smoke billowed into the Great Hall, expanding with terrifying speed. The roar of the crowd shifted instantly from a low hum to a collective gasp, followed by a rising tide of screams. Panic, raw and contagious, swept through the concourse. People began to run, shoving against each other, desperate to escape the sudden, blinding fog. "Drop." Brill's voice echoed in Hayes's memory. She didn't hesitate. She let go of the briefcase and threw herself onto the cold marble floor, curling into a tight ball, covering her head with her arms. The smoke washed over her, thick and acrid, burning her throat and eyes. The noise was deafening, the sound of hundreds of people stampeding, luggage crashing to the floor, shouts of confusion and terror. David stumbled backward, coughing, raising his hands to shield his face. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Take her. Grab the case." The 4 Vanguard operatives moved. They drew concealed weapons, their discipline holding against the panic of the crowd. They pushed forward through the smoke, converging on David and the spot where Hayes had been standing. They were blind. Brill was not. He dropped from the balcony, a silent dark shape falling through the thick white fog. He landed in a crouch 10 feet from the Vanguard team. He didn't carry a firearm. A gunshot in this chaos would be reckless. He carried a karambit, a curved hawkbill blade designed for devastating close-quarters combat. He moved into the smoke, a predator entering its natural habitat. The closest operative was sweeping his weapon back and forth, trying to find a target in the whiteout. Brill stepped up behind him. He didn't hesitate. He brought the karambit up in a tight, vicious arc, hooking the curved blade behind the man's knee and severing the hamstring with a single brutal motion. The operative collapsed with a scream, his leg useless. Before the man hit the ground, Brill drove the point of the blade into the man's brachial artery, just below the armpit. A massive surge of blood sprayed into the white smoke. The man dropped his weapon and fell, bleeding out in seconds. The second operative heard the scream. He spun around, raising his pistol, firing blindly into the fog. The shot echoed like a cannon blast, sending the remaining civilians in the hall into a complete frenzy. Brill was already moving. He slipped under the man's line of fire, driving a hard knee into the operative's groin. As the man doubled over, Brill brought the heavy pommel of the karambit down on the base of his skull. The operative hit the marble floor, unconscious. 2 down. 10 seconds. The third and fourth operatives realized their numerical advantage was gone. They backed up, standing shoulder to shoulder, their weapons raised, scanning the swirling smoke. "He's in the smoke," one yelled. "Watch your 6." David stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, coughing violently, the aluminum briefcase forgotten at his feet. "Get me out of here," he screamed. Brill didn't attack the two operatives directly. He used the environment. He grabbed a heavy brass luggage cart, abandoned by a fleeing traveler. He pushed it hard, sending it rolling rapidly through the smoke directly toward the two remaining gunmen. The operatives saw the shape emerging from the fog. They fired 3 sharp cracks, putting rounds into the brass frame of the cart. While they were focused on the decoy, Brill flanked them. He emerged from the smoke on their left, moving with terrifying speed. He grabbed the barrel of the nearest operative's pistol, twisting it upward and snapping the man's wrist with a sickening crunch. He drove the blade of the karambit into the side of the man's neck, a quick, deep puncture wound, and ripped it free. The fourth operative finally saw him. He swung his weapon around, his finger tightening on the trigger. Brill threw the bloody karambit. The curved blade spun through the air, burying itself to the hilt in the operative's thigh. The man screamed, his shot going wild, shattering the glass face of the brass clock above them. Brill closed the distance in 2 strides. He delivered a brutal, sweeping kick to the man's injured leg, dropping him to the floor. A swift stomp to the man's jaw ended the fight. The great hall was a slaughterhouse hidden in a cloud of white smoke. The only sounds were the distant wail of sirens, the moans of the dying operatives, and David's terrified coughing. Brill walked over to the former chief of staff. David backed away, his eyes wide with horror, as he saw the blood covering Brill's hands and clothes. "You?" David gasped. "Who are you?" Brill didn't answer. He drew the captured Glock 19 from his waistband. He aimed at David's right leg and pulled the trigger. The 9mm round shattered David's femur. The politician collapsed onto the marble floor, shrieking in agony, clutching his ruined leg. Brill holstered the weapon. He walked through the dissipating smoke to where Victoria Hayes lay curled on the floor. "Get up," Brill said. She looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. She saw the blood on his hands. She heard David screaming. Brill reached down, grabbed her by the arm, and hauled her to her feet. "We are leaving," he said. He didn't grab the aluminum briefcase. He didn't look at the bodies on the floor. He guided Hayes through the thinning smoke, melting into the panicked crowd streaming out the side exits, disappearing into the cold Chicago rain before the first police sirens reached the station doors. Chapter 10. The stolen 1998 Ford F-150 smelled of wet dog and stale tobacco, a harsh contrast to the adrenaline still pumping through Victoria Hayes's veins. Brill drove with the same mechanical precision, navigating the back roads of Illinois, heading away from the chaos of Chicago. Hayes sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in her damp coat, staring blankly out the window. The violence at Union Station played on a continuous loop in her mind. The screams. The blood. The casual, terrifying efficiency with which Brill had dismantled 4 trained men. She turned to look at him. His face was a mask of cold detachment, illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. The blood on his hands had dried to a dark, rusty brown. "You shot him," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the hum of the engine. "David." Brill didn't take his eyes off the road. He was a liability. "You shattered his leg." "He will survive," Brill said. "He will tell Vanguard what happened. He will tell them, I am not a target to be hunted. I am a predator to be feared. The paradigm has shifted." He checked the rearview mirror. The dark road behind them was empty. "We need a place to go to ground," Brill said. "A place off the grid. A place Vanguard won't look." "I don't know anywhere," she said, rubbing her temples, the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. "My life is a public record. Every property, every association." "Not your life," Brill corrected. "Mine." He drove for another 2 hours, turning off the state highway onto a narrow, unpaved road that wound its way into a dense forest. The trees formed a canopy overhead, blocking out the moonlight, plunging the truck into absolute darkness. Brill navigated by memory, the headlights illuminating only the rutted dirt path ahead. The road ended at a small, dilapidated cabin, hidden deep in the woods. The roof sagged, the windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling in long gray strips. It looked abandoned, forgotten. "Get out," Brill said, killing the engine. Hayes stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting through her coat. She looked at the cabin, apprehension knotting in her stomach. "This is it." "It's secure," Brill said, grabbing his canvas duffel bag. He walked to the heavy wooden door, unlocked a rusted padlock with a key from his pocket, and pushed it open. The interior smelled of dust, dry wood, and old leather. Brill flipped a switch on the wall. A single, low-wattage bulb flickered to life, casting long, wavering shadows across the small room. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A simple cot, a potbelly stove, a sturdy wooden table, and a locked metal cabinet bolted to the wall. "Sit," Brill ordered, pointing to the cot. Hayes sat down heavily, the exhaustion finally overcoming her. She watched as Brill opened the duffel bag and pulled out a specialized medical kit. He moved to the table, opened the kit, and began laying out supplies with the same meticulous precision he used when cleaning his weapons. Gauze bandages, a bottle of clear liquid, a suture kit. He removed his tactical sweater, revealing the black combat shirt underneath. The shirt was torn on the left arm, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. Hayes gasped. "You're hurt." "A graze," Brill said, his voice flat. "From the second operative in the train station." He didn't ask for help. He didn't show any sign of pain. He simply poured the clear liquid over the wound, his face remaining entirely expressionless as the antiseptic burned into the torn flesh. He picked up a curved needle and began stitching the wound himself, his movements steady, practiced. Hayes watched him, a mixture of horror and fascination washing over her. He was a machine, a weapon, devoid of fear or hesitation. "How do you do it?" she asked again, the question tearing from her lips. "How do you turn off the fear?" Brill finished the last stitch, tying off the thread and snipping it with a pair of small scissors. He wiped away the excess blood with a piece of gauze. "You don't turn it off," he said, pulling his sweater back on. "You use it. Fear is a biological response to a threat. It heightens your senses, sharpens your focus, prepares your body for action. You don't let it paralyze you. You let it drive you." He turned to face her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "The men hunting you," Brill continued, "they rely on your fear. They expect you to panic, to run, to make mistakes. We are going to use their expectations against them." "How?" "By doing exactly what they don't expect," Brill said. "We are going to stop running. He walked to the metal cabinet bolted to the wall. He unlocked it, revealing a small arsenal of weaponry. Rifles, handguns, explosives, specialized tactical gear. The data center in Chicago, Brill said, running his hand over the cold steel of a customized Mk-18 carbine. The dead drop. It's not just a communications node. It's a staging area. A logistical hub for vanguard operations in the Midwest. You want to attack it, Hayes said, the realization dawning on her. Yes. It's a corporate building, she argued, her political instincts kicking in. Security cameras, guards, alarms. It's suicide. It's a calculated risk, Brill corrected. They expect us to be defensive. They expect us to hide. They are not preparing for an offensive strike on their own infrastructure. He pulled the Mk-18 from the cabinet, checking the action, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the small cabin. I am going to infiltrate the data center, Brill said. I am going to download the Vanguard command structure, identify the handler, and destroy the servers. And me, she asked, her voice trembling. What do I do? Brill turned to her, the weapon held loosely in his hands. You stay here, he said. You stay in the dark. And you wait. He walked to a heavy iron trapdoor, set into the wooden floorboards near the potbelly stove. He grabbed the iron ring and pulled it open, revealing a dark subterranean root cellar. 3 days, Brill said, pointing down into the darkness. Food, water, and a secure communications device. You do not come out unless I return. And if you don't return. Brill didn't answer immediately. He looked at the former senator, a woman who had commanded power and respect, now reduced to hiding in a hole in the ground. He reached into his waistband, pulled the captured Glock 19 and handed it to her. Then you use this, Brill said. And you make them pay for every inch. Victoria Hayes took the heavy weapon, her hands shaking. She looked down into the dark root cellar, then back at the ghost standing before her. She nodded once, a silent agreement to the terms of her survival. She climbed down the wooden ladder into the darkness. Brill closed the heavy iron trapdoor, sealing her in. He stood alone in the cabin, the Mk-18 slung across his chest. Chapter 11. Brill drove the stolen F-150 back down the rutted dirt track. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the black trees. He left Victoria Hayes buried in the earth. She had food, water, and a firearm. She also had fear. The fear would keep her awake. It would keep her quiet. He reached the state highway and turned east toward the rising sun. He drove for an hour, pulling into the desolate parking lot of a regional commuter rail station. He wiped down the steering wheel, the shifter, and the door handles with an ammonia-soaked rag. He left the keys in the ignition. Someone would steal the truck before noon. It would vanish into a chop shop, erasing his trail. He carried the Mk-18 in the canvas duffel bag. The heavy winter coat concealed his tactical rig and the suppressed Glock 19. He bought a ticket with cash from an automated kiosk and boarded the first train into Chicago. He sat in the rear car. The train rattled and swayed. Tired commuters filled the seats around him. They stared at their phones. They drank bad coffee. They ignored the man with the cold, dark eyes sitting in the corner. Brill remained still. He was a stone in a rushing river. The train slid into the subterranean terminal beneath the city. Brill stepped onto the concrete platform. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, hot brake dust, and damp wool. He climbed the stairs to the street level. The Loop. A harsh, freezing wind blew off Lake Michigan, whipping between the concrete canyons. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Brill walked 3 blocks north. He found a newsstand across the street from a 40-story tower of black glass and brushed steel. A brass plaque mounted next to the revolving doors read, Apex Solutions. Brill bought a newspaper. He folded it under his arm and leaned against a concrete planter. He studied the target. Vanguard hid in plain sight. Apex Solutions provided high-end data security for corporate clients. It offered a legitimate front for a clandestine operation. The building had an overt security posture. Brill analyzed the layers. 2 uniformed guards stood behind a marble reception desk in the lobby. They monitored a bank of flat-screen displays. Employees swiped magnetic keycards to pass through waist-high optical turnstiles. The elevators required a secondary fob to access specific floors. 4 pan-tilt zoom cameras covered the exterior plaza. 2 more watched the entrance to the underground parking garage. The garage featured a hardened steel roller door and a manned security booth with bullet-resistant glass. A frontal assault was tactical suicide. It required an army. Brill operated alone. He needed a seam. He needed the basement. Viper 1 had given him the intel. The dead drop, the Vanguard communication node, resided in the sub-basement, off the grid, separate from the corporate servers above. Brill walked away from the newsstand. He moved south, away from the sleek glass facade. He navigated the narrow alleys behind the commercial buildings. The polished veneer of the city faded, replaced by rusted dumpsters, grease traps, and graffiti-scarred brick. He found a heavy cast-iron maintenance grate set into the cracked asphalt. It covered a utility access shaft leading to the city's labyrinth of steam tunnels and sewer mains. A delivery truck rattled down the alley, its diesel engine echoing between the brick walls. Brill timed his move. As the truck passed, blocking the line of sight from the main street, he dropped to one knee. He jammed a pry bar under the edge of the iron grate. He leveraged his weight, lifting the heavy iron slab, and slid it aside. He dropped into the dark hole. He reached up and pulled the grate back into place over his head. The subterranean world swallowed him. Total darkness. The air hung thick and heavy, smelling of raw sewage, damp earth, and decaying rats. Brill pulled a small penlight from his rig. He snapped a red lens over the bulb to preserve his night vision. A narrow beam of crimson light cut through the gloom. He stood in a brick tunnel built a century ago. Thick pipes wrapped in decaying asbestos insulation ran along the curved ceiling. A shallow trench of dark, stagnant water flowed down the center. He moved forward. His soft-soled boots made no sound on the slick brick walkway. He navigated the maze using a mental map constructed from public works blueprints he had memorized years ago. He took 2 left turns, followed a steam pipe, descending a narrow flight of concrete stairs, and entered a lower access corridor. He stopped. The brick wall on his right ended, replaced by a sheer face of modern, reinforced concrete. The foundation of the Apex Solutions building. Brill ran a gloved hand over the cold, rough surface. He followed the wall for 30 yards until he found a utility junction. A bundle of thick, black power cables and fiber optic lines punched through a 3-foot diameter steel bulkhead set into the concrete. This was the tether, the umbilical cord connecting the fortress to the city grid. Brill set his canvas duffel bag on the dry concrete walkway. He unzipped it. He bypassed the Mk-18 carbine and reached for a heavy, rectangular hard case at the bottom. He opened the case. It contained a specialized thermal breaching lance. It consisted of a pressurized oxygen cylinder attached to a dense core of magnesium and steel rods. He assembled the lance. He strapped a dark welding visor to his forehead. The steel bulkhead was rated to withstand a bomb blast. It could stop bullets. It could stop C4. It could not stop chemistry. Brill cracked the oxygen valve. He struck a flint igniter near the tip of the rod. The lance flared to life with a violent, hissing roar. The tip burned at over 4,000 degrees. It produced a blinding, blue-white light that banished the crimson shadows of the tunnel. Brill lowered the visor over his eyes. He stepped up to the bulkhead. He pressed the burning tip of the lance against the thick steel plate, inches away from the vulnerable fiber optic cables. The steel did not melt. It vaporized. A shower of white-hot sparks cascaded onto the tunnel floor. Molten slag dripped like bright orange syrup. Brill held the lance steady, tracing a tight circle through the armor plating. He breathed in a slow, controlled rhythm, ignoring the intense heat radiating against his face. He worked with brutal, silent efficiency. Chapter 12. The thermal lance died with a sharp hiss. Brill stepped back, flipping the dark visor up. He stood before a perfect, glowing circle cut into the 3-foot-thick steel bulkhead. The severed slab of armor plating leaned precariously against the interior concrete, glowing a dull, angry red. Brill didn't wait for it to cool. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a heavy pair of Nomex gloves, the kind used by aircraft crash rescue teams. He gripped the edge of the glowing steel slab and hauled it backward. It hit the tunnel floor with a massive clang, sending a final shower of sparks into the dark water. He had breached the perimeter. He stepped through the circular opening. The air inside the Apex Solutions sub-basement was completely different from the damp, sewage-scented tunnel. It was frigid, aggressively filtered, and hummed with the high-frequency vibration of heavy processors. He stood in a narrow utility corridor. Thick bundles of fiber optic cables ran along the ceiling, disappearing into a reinforced concrete wall ahead. A single, heavy security door marked the entrance to the Vanguard server farm. Brill dropped the Nomex gloves and picked up the Mk-18 carbine. He moved to the security door. It was a biometric lock, requiring a retinal scan and a thumbprint. He didn't have either. He knelt beside the locking mechanism. He used a specialized Torx driver to remove the hardened steel faceplate, exposing the wiring harness beneath. He attached a small black device, slightly larger than a smartphone, to the exposed wires, a brute force sequencer designed to cycle through millions of cryptographic combinations per second. He watched the tiny digital display on the sequencer race through numbers. 30 seconds passed. A minute. A sharp, synthetic click. The heavy deadbolts retracted. Brill pushed the door open. He stepped into the Vanguard command node. The room was vast, larger than the basement of the Georgetown townhouse. Row upon row of black server racks stretched into the distance, blinking with thousands of green and blue LED lights. The ambient noise was a steady, deafening roar of cooling fans. This was the brain, the repository of secrets, the logistical hub coordinating the hunt for Victoria Hayes. 2 men occupied the room. They weren't tactical operators. They were technicians, sitting at a curved console near the center of the server farm, monitoring a bank of high-resolution displays. They wore white short-sleeve shirts and dark ties. They looked like IT support, but they were managing a private intelligence network. They didn't hear Brill enter over the roar of the fans. Brill moved with absolute silence, ghosting between the towering server racks. He didn't raise his rifle. A firefight in a room full of hard drives was a last resort. He needed the data intact before he destroyed the hardware. He reached the console. He stepped up behind the 2 technicians. He moved with the same terrifying, fluid speed he had used in the townhouse kitchen. He grabbed the back of the first technician's chair, violently yanking it backward, spilling the man onto the raised flooring. Simultaneously, he drove the heavy polymer stock of the Mk-18 into the base of the second technician's skull. The second man slumped forward onto the keyboard, unconscious. The first technician scrambled backward, his eyes wide with shock, opening his mouth to yell. Brill stepped on the man's chest, pinning him to the floor. He leveled the suppressed barrel of the MK-18 inches from the man's face. "Do not speak," Brill said, his voice cutting through the noise of the fans. The technician froze, staring up at the dark, silent predator standing over him. He nodded frantically, his hands raised in surrender. "The terminal," Brill said, gesturing to the console with the barrel of the rifle. "Unlock it." He stepped back, allowing the terrified man to sit up. The technician scrambled back to his chair, his hands shaking violently as he typed his credentials into the system. The screens unlocked, revealing a complex encrypted interface. "I need the command structure," Brill said. "The active, operational node. The handler, coordinating the extraction of the Barak drives." I can't," the technician stammered, his eyes darting to the unconscious man next to him. "It's compartmentalized. I don't have that level of access." Brill didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He reached into his tactical rig and pulled out the heavy medical shears he had used on Viper 1 in the meatpacking plant. They were still stained with dried blood. He set the shears on the console next to the keyboard. "I am going to ask you one more time," Brill said, his voice flat, reasonable, and utterly terrifying. "I need the command structure." The technician stared at the bloody shears. He looked at Brill's face. He saw the complete absence of hesitation. "It's a shadow directory," the technician said, his voice breaking. "I can give you the routing pathway, but I can't decrypt the final destination file without the handler's active key." "Give me the pathway," Brill ordered. He pulled a high-capacity, encrypted thumb drive from his pocket and plugged it into the console. The technician worked frantically, his fingers flying across the keyboard, routing the heavily guarded command structure data onto Brill's drive. "Done," the technician whispered, backing away from the console. Brill pocketed the drive. He had the map. He would find a way to read it. "The security response protocol," Brill said. "How long until the guards upstairs realize the sub-basement has been compromised?" "There's an automated ping every 15 minutes, the technician said. "If I don't respond, they send a team down. You have maybe 8 minutes." "Good," Brill said. He struck the man hard across the jaw with the butt of the MK-18. The technician collapsed onto the floor, joining his unconscious partner. Brill didn't waste time binding them. 8 minutes was a lifetime. He moved to the primary server racks. He opened his canvas duffel bag. He bypassed the explosives. He pulled out a specialized electronic device, a high-powered, military-grade magnetron salvaged from a decommissioned radar installation. He set the magnetron on the floor next to the primary data array. He linked it to a heavy lithium-ion battery pack. He wasn't going to blow up the servers. An explosion would trigger the building's fire suppression system and alert the entire city block. He was going to wipe them clean. A massive, concentrated electromagnetic field that would scramble every magnetic hard drive in the room, turning terabytes of blackmail and intelligence into useless digital noise. He set the timer on the magnetron for 3 minutes. He walked back to the security door. He stepped into the utility corridor and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing the unconscious technicians inside the server farm. He didn't run. He walked back to the breached bulkhead. He squeezed through the glowing circular hole, stepping back into the damp, sewage-scented tunnel. He replaced the Nomex gloves and picked up the heavy steel slab he had cut from the bulkhead. He hauled it back into place, sealing the opening. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it would hide the breach long enough for him to vanish. He moved down the dark tunnel, his penlight cutting a narrow crimson path through the gloom. Behind him, deep inside the reinforced concrete bunker of Apex Solutions, the magnetron fired. It was silent. A massive wave of electromagnetic energy washed over the server farm. Hard drives seized. Solid-state drives fused. The digital leverage Vanguard held over politicians, generals, and CEOs evaporated in a millisecond. Brill climbed the rusted ladder back to the alleyway. He pushed the heavy iron grate aside, slipped out onto the wet asphalt, and pulled the grate back into place. He walked out of the alley, blending into the morning pedestrian traffic on the loop. He was just another man in a winter coat, moving through the cold wind. He had the command structure in his pocket. He had blinded Vanguard. He had taken the offensive. He headed for Union Station to catch a train back to the cabin. Back to the dark hole where Victoria Hayes waited, terrified and alone, surrounded by the silence Brill had left behind. Chapter 13. The train ride back was a study in stillness. Brill Wingfield sat near the window, the Mk-18 carbine broken down inside the canvas duffel bag resting between his feet. He watched the gray suburbs blur into open farmland. He didn't sleep. He ran the permutations of the coming hours. Vanguard was blind, but a blind beast was still dangerous. It would lash out. The lack of communication from the Chicago node would trigger fail-safes. The handler, whoever they were, would realize the offensive had begun. They would stop looking for a frightened politician and start hunting the man who had burned their house down. Brill retrieved the stolen F-150 from the commuter lot. It sat untouched, a testament to its complete unremarkable nature. He drove back toward the cabin, the sun burning off the morning haze, casting long, sharp shadows across the forest road. He didn't drive directly to the cabin. He parked the truck 2 miles away, hiding it down a forgotten logging trail. He covered the windshield with pine boughs to break the reflection. He walked the rest of the way, moving parallel to the dirt road, staying deep in the tree line. He approached the cabin from the high ground to the north. It sat exactly as he had left it. The boarded windows, the sagging roof, the absolute stillness. But Brill didn't rely on appearances. He studied the subtle indicators. The way the dry grass lay near the front step. The absence of birdsong in the immediate vicinity. The faint, metallic smell that didn't belong in a pine forest. He pulled the suppressed Glock 19 from his rig. He circled the cabin, a shadow moving through the trees. He found the first anomaly 50 yards from the back door. A footprint in the soft earth. Deep tread. Tactical boot. Vanguard had found them. The breadcrumb he had left with the Taurus in Baltimore hadn't just drawn them, it had provided a vector. While he was in Chicago, a secondary team had been sweeping the likely routes west. They had found the cabin. Brill didn't rush. He analyzed the footprint. The depth indicated a man carrying heavy gear. The spacing of the stride suggested a deliberate, cautious approach. They weren't inside the cabin. If they were inside, the iron trapdoor would be open, and Victoria Hayes would be dead or captured. They were staging. They were waiting for him to return. Brill moved laterally, expanding his search radius. He found the overwatch position. It was a small rise covered in thick scrub oak, offering a clear line of sight to the cabin's front door. A man lay prone beneath a camouflage netting, a high-powered sniper rifle resting on a bipod. He wore a ghillie suit that blended perfectly with the dead leaves and brown earth. Brill flanked him. He moved with agonizing slowness, placing each footstep with deliberate care, avoiding dry twigs and loose gravel. He approached the sniper from the blind spot directly behind the man's boots. He drew the karambit blade. He closed the last 5 yards in a sudden, silent rush. He dropped a knee onto the sniper's spine, pinning him to the ground, and clamped his left hand over the man's mouth. At the same time, he drove the curved blade of the karambit deep into the soft tissue just beneath the base of the skull, severing the brainstem. The sniper died instantly, a violent spasm racking his body before he went entirely limp. Brill held him down until the twitching stopped. He carefully removed his hand from the man's mouth. He wiped the bloody blade on the ghillie suit. He took the sniper's radio headset and slipped it over his own ear. Sierra 2, this is actual. Status. A voice crackled in his ear. Crisp, disciplined. The assault team commander. Brill didn't answer. He listened to the silence on the channel. Sierra 2, report, the voice repeated, a slight edge of tension creeping in. Brill keyed the microphone. He didn't try to mimic the dead sniper. He spoke in his own voice, a cold, flat transmission that cut through the encrypted frequency. Sierra 2 is dead, Brill said. A long, heavy silence filled the channel. Brill could almost hear the tactical calculus shifting in the commander's mind. The trap they had set had just become a kill zone. All units compromise, the commander barked. Execute. Execute. Brill moved instantly. He abandoned the sniper's nest and sprinted toward the cabin. 3 men in black tactical gear burst from the tree line on the east side of the clearing. They carried short-barreled assault rifles, moving in a practiced wedge formation toward the front door. They weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. They were relying on speed and overwhelming violence. They didn't know Brill had wired the approach. He hit a small remote detonator on his rig as he ran. A directional claymore mine, hidden beneath the porch steps, detonated with a deafening roar. Thousands of steel ball bearings ripped through the air, shredding the wooden stairs and tearing into the point man. The man was thrown backward, his armor absorbing some of the impact, but his legs and arms taking the brunt of the shrapnel. He went down, screaming. The remaining 2 men scattered, diving for cover behind a rusted-out tractor sitting in the tall grass. Brill reached the back wall of the cabin. He didn't try to go through the door. It was a fatal funnel. He moved to the boarded-up window nearest the wood stove. He kicked the rotting wood hard, splintering the boards, and dove headfirst through the opening. He hit the floor of the cabin and rolled, coming up with the Mk-18 carbine leveled at the front door. The air inside smelled of dust, and the sharp tang of high explosives from the claymore outside. Victoria! Brill yelled, his voice echoing in the small room. A muffled, terrified scream answered him from beneath the floorboards. She was still in the root cellar. Automatic gunfire erupted outside. The 2 men behind the tractor opened up, pouring a sustained volley through the front of the cabin. Wood splintered. Plaster dusted the air. Rounds tore through the thin walls with terrifying ease. Brill dropped flat. He crawled toward the heavy wooden table, dragging it across the floor to flip it onto its side, creating a makeshift barricade between the door and the trapdoor leading to the cellar. He keyed the captured radio headset. "You are wasting ammunition," Brill said calmly over the channel. "The structure is not reinforced. Your rounds are passing straight through." The gunfire stopped abruptly. "Who is this?" the commander demanded over the radio. "I am the audit," Brill said. "The ghost," the commander replied, a grim recognition in his voice. "You burned Apex." "I burned the node," Brill corrected. "Now I am going to burn you." A low, rhythmic thumping sound began to build in the distance, a heavy vibration that rattled the loose boards of the cabin. Brill recognized the sound immediately. It wasn't thunder. It was the distinct chop of a heavy utility helicopter. Vanguard wasn't just using a ground team. They had air support. "You are out of time," the commander said over the radio, a note of triumph in his voice. "We have thermals. We have heavy ordnance. Come out with the package, and we will make it quick." Brill didn't reply. He pulled the encrypted thumb drive from his pocket, the command structure he had taken from the data center. He slid it under the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor ensuring Victoria Hayes had it if the worst happened. He racked the charging handle of the Mk-18. Chapter 14. The air in the cabin tasted of pulverized wood and copper. Brill Wingfield knelt behind the overturned table, the Mk-18 carbine resting against the thick oak top. The silence following the helicopter's arrival was heavy, expectant. The Vanguard commander was giving him a moment to realize the math had changed. The low, rhythmic thumping of the rotors grew louder, a physical pressure beating against the roof. The helicopter was circling, establishing overwatch. "Last chance, Ghost," the commander's voice crackled over the radio earpiece. "Thermals show one heat signature in the cabin. The package is either dead or underground. We are bringing the roof down." Brill didn't touch the radio. He moved. He didn't run for the back window he had breached. That was the obvious exit, the one they would be covering. He moved to the small, potbelly stove sitting in the center of the room. A heavy cast-iron chimney pipe ran straight up through the ceiling. He unslung the Mk-18 and reached into his tactical rig, pulling out a block of C4 no larger than a deck of cards. He pressed it against the ceiling joints, immediately surrounding the chimney pipe, embedding a detonator cap into the gray explosive. Outside, the helicopter banked hard. A harsh, electronic whine signaled the spooling of a heavy weapon. Not a machine gun, a minigun. Brill dove for the overturned table. The world erupted. A torrent of 7.62 mm rounds from the helicopter's minigun tore through the roof of the cabin like a massive, invisible chainsaw. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening, continuous roar that drowned out everything else. The wooden shingles, the support beams, the floorboards, everything disintegrated under the concentrated fire. Brill lay flat beneath the heavy oak table, his arms covering his head. The table shuddered violently as rounds chewed through the edges, showering him with splinters. Dust and debris choked the air, turning the cabin into a chaotic, swirling gray void. The barrage lasted for 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. The minigun ceased firing. The helicopter pulled up, the thumping of its rotors shifting in pitch as it climbed. "Assault team, move in," the commander ordered over the radio. "Clear the rubble. Find the cellar." Brill didn't wait for the dust to settle. He triggered the detonator he had placed by the chimney. The C4 blew a localized, concentrated hole straight through the weakened roof structure, taking the cast-iron pipe with it. The explosion kicked up a secondary cloud of dust, thicker and darker than the first. Brill grabbed the Mk-18, scrambled out from under the ruined table, and jumped. He didn't jump toward the door or the windows. He jumped straight up, catching the jagged edges of the hole he had just blown in the ceiling. He hauled himself up onto the remaining section of the roof, his boots slipping on the slick, fragmented shingles. He was out of the fatal funnel. He was on the high ground. He dropped flat against the slope of the roof, sliding his suppressed Mk-18 over the ridge. He had a clear view of the clearing below. The two surviving Vanguard operatives from the initial assault were moving cautiously toward the front of the ruined cabin. They were sweeping their weapons, their attention focused entirely on the ground level, expecting to find bodies or a trapdoor in the rubble. They didn't look up. Brill sighted the lead operative. He adjusted for the downward angle and squeezed the trigger. Peefed PFFT. 2 rounds took the man in the back of the neck, just above the collar of his tactical vest. He dropped without a sound, folding into the tall grass. The second operative heard the impact. He spun around, trying to locate the source of the suppressed fire, his eyes scanning the tree line. Brill shifted his aim and fired again. The second man went down, a clean shot through the temple. "Assault team, report." The commander's voice on the radio was sharp, urgent. He was watching from the helicopter, but the dust cloud from the explosion still obscured the immediate area around the cabin. Brill didn't respond. He rolled onto his back, searching the gray sky. The helicopter, a dark gray MH-6 Little Bird, was hovering 100 yards away, 50 feet off the ground. The side door was open. Brill could see the silhouette of the door gunner manning the minigun, scanning the tree line. He could see the faint outline of the commander sitting in the co-pilot's seat. An Mk-18 carbine against an armored helicopter was a losing proposition. The 5.56 mm rounds would spark harmlessly off the fuselage. But Brill didn't aim for the fuselage. He reached into his duffel bag, which he had dragged up onto the roof with him. He pulled out the heavy, rectangular hard case he had used in Chicago. He didn't have the thermal lance. He had the high-powered, military-grade magnetron. He had salvaged 2 from the radar installation. He had used 1 on the servers. He had kept the second. He quickly connected the lithium-ion battery pack, his hands moving with practiced mechanical efficiency. He didn't set a timer. He wired the magnetron to a manual trigger switch salvaged from the Claymore detonator. "Actual, this is Eagle 1, the helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Dust is clearing. I have 2 men down in the yard. No movement from the structure." "Put another burst into the footprint," the commander ordered. "Turn it into matchsticks." The helicopter banked, turning its nose toward the cabin, bringing the minigun to bear. Brill stood up on the sloping roof. He didn't seek cover. He held the magnetron unit, a bulky, unpainted metal box, against his chest, pointing the directional emitter directly at the hovering helicopter. The door gunner saw him. The man shouted something into his headset, swinging the heavy barrel of the minigun toward the figure standing on the roof. Brill pressed the trigger switch. A massive, invisible wave of focused electromagnetic energy blasted upward. It struck the helicopter with the force of a digital sledgehammer. The results were instantaneous. The digital displays in the Little Bird's cockpit blanked out. The electronic fuel injection system fused. The fly-by-wire controls seized completely. The turbine engine choked, a harsh mechanical grinding sound replacing the smooth roar of the rotors. The helicopter didn't explode. It simply died in midair. Gravity took over. The Little Bird dropped like a stone. It hit the ground 50 yards from the cabin, the main rotor blades shattering against the earth, sending massive shards of composite material spinning into the trees. The fuselage crumpled, the tail boom snapping with a sharp crack. A heavy, profound silence fell over the clearing. The dust from the crash drifted slowly through the cold air. Brill lowered the magnetron. He let the battery pack drop to the roof. He picked up his Mk-18 and slid down the slope, dropping the last 10 feet to the ground. He walked slowly toward the wreckage of the helicopter. The smell of spilled aviation fuel hung heavy in the air. The fuselage was a mangled ruin of gray metal and shattered glass. The pilot and the door gunner were dead, killed by the violent impact. The commander was alive. He was trapped in the co-pilot's seat, the crushed instrument panel pinning his legs. He was bleeding from a severe head wound, his face a mask of shock and pain. He watched Brill approach through the shattered windshield. Brill stopped 10 feet from the wreckage. He didn't raise his weapon. He stood still, the cold wind pulling at his dark sweater. The commander coughed, a wet rattling sound. He looked at the ghost, standing in the ruins of his assault force. "You're a dead man," the commander wheezed, his voice weak. "You burned Apex. You killed a Vanguard team. They won't stop. They have the director. They have everything." Brill's eyes narrowed slightly. He stepped closer to the wreckage. "The director," Brill repeated softly. Sterling? The commander gasped, his eyes rolling back in his head. Sterling wants the drives. You can't fight Washington. The man's head slumped forward. He didn't speak again. Brill stood perfectly still. Sterling. The director of national intelligence. The handler. The head of the snake. He turned away from the burning wreckage. The siege was over. Vanguard was broken here, their forces scattered, their leadership exposed. But the threat wasn't neutralized. It was simply relocated. He walked back to the ruined cabin, stepping over the debris and the bodies. He reached the overturned table and hauled it aside. He grabbed the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor and pulled. Victoria Hayes was crouched at the bottom of the ladder, the Glock 19 trembling in both hands, pointed directly up at the opening. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She looked like a woman who had spent an eternity in hell. It's over, Brill said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She lowered the gun slowly, staring up at him. She saw the dust coating his clothes, the cold, detached look in his eyes. She didn't ask what happened. The silence told her enough. We need to move, Brill said, extending a hand down into the darkness. I know who is hunting you. Chapter 15. The silence in the ruined cabin was profound, broken only by the distant dying crackle of a small fire in the helicopter wreckage. The air was thick with the smell of pulverized wood, cordite, and aviation fuel. Brill Wingfield stood near the trapdoor, extending a hand down into the root cellar. Victoria Hayes hesitated. The darkness of the cellar had been terrifying, but the sudden, violent light of the world above, the sound of the minigun tearing the roof apart, was paralyzing. She looked at Brill's hand, a hand that had just dismantled an assault force and downed a helicopter. She took it. Brill hauled her up. She scrambled out of the hole, her boots finding purchase on the splintered floorboards. She stood up, brushing dirt from her damp cashmere sweater, and looked around. The cabin was gone. Only the walls remained, standing like jagged teeth against the gray afternoon sky. The roof was a shattered memory. The potbelly stove lay on its side, the iron chimney pipe completely missing. Hayes walked slowly to the edge of the ruined structure. She looked out into the clearing. She saw the bodies in the tall grass. She saw the mangled, smoking wreckage of the MH-6 Little Bird 50 yards away. The smell of the spilled fuel made her stomach heave. My God, she whispered. She turned back to Brill. He was already moving. He knelt by the iron trapdoor, reaching down into the dirt where he had slid the encrypted thumb drive. He retrieved it, wiping the dust from the black plastic casing. Is that from Chicago? She asked, her voice tight. Yes, Brill said. The Vanguard command structure. You said you couldn't decrypt it. I can't, Brill replied, slipping the drive into his pocket. But I don't need to. The commander of the assault team confirmed the handler before he died. Hayes gripped the edge of the splintered wall, her knuckles white. Who? Director Sterling, Brill said, his voice flat, emotionless. The name hit her like a physical blow. Sterling. The director of national intelligence. The man who briefed the president every morning. The man who oversaw the CIA, the NSA, and the DIA. He wasn't a rogue contractor. He was the apex of the American intelligence apparatus. That's impossible, she breathed, shaking her head. Sterling is. He's an institution. He's been in Washington for 30 years. Which is exactly why he wants the Barack drives, Brill said. 30 years in Washington builds a lot of enemies. And a lot of ambition. If he controls the raw intelligence on the drives, he controls the political landscape. He guarantees his own survival. Or his own ascension. Ascension. The presidency, Brill said. He wants the Oval Office, and he wants the leverage to ensure no one stands in his way. Hayes leaned against the ruined wall, the magnitude of the conspiracy settling over her. She had been running from a hit squad, but she was really running from the United States government itself. Vanguard wasn't a splinter group. It was a private army operating under the direct authority of the DNI. "We can't fight him," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He has the entire apparatus. He can classify us as terrorists. He can order a drone strike. This isn't a street fight anymore." "It was never a street fight," Brill said. He picked up his canvas duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder. "It is a game of leverage. Sterling believes he has the upper hand because he controls the board. But a board can be overturned." "How?" Brill walked past her, stepping out of the ruined cabin and into the clearing. He didn't look back at the bodies or the helicopter. "We go to Virginia," he said. Hayes hurried after him, struggling to keep pace as he moved toward the tree line. "Virginia. Why?" "Because Sterling has a private estate in Great Falls," Brill said. "It's a fortress. Heavily guarded, isolated. He uses it to conduct business off the books. And you want to attack it?" The panic was returning, a sharp cold edge in her chest. "I don't want to attack it," Brill said. "I want to infiltrate it." They reached the edge of the forest. The shadows beneath the canopy were deep and cold. Brill stopped, turning to face her. "Sterling thinks he has won," Brill explained, his voice low and precise. "The assault team reported the cabin destroyed. They reported you dead or trapped. Sterling will feel secure. He will be at his estate, reviewing his options, planning his next move. We are going to strike while he believes he is invulnerable." "You can't just walk into a fortress," she argued. "I won't walk in," Brill said. "I will slip in. And you are going to help me." Hayes stared at him, the color draining from her face. "Me? I can barely hold a gun. I can't fight." "You don't need to fight," Brill said. "You need to be the bait." Again. The word tore from her throat. "I was bait in Union Station, and people died. David was crippled. I won't do it." Brill didn't flinch. He didn't offer comfort or reassurance. He stated the tactical reality. "If you run, you will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder," Brill said. "Sterling will never stop hunting you. The only way to survive is to cut the head off the snake. And to do that, I need to get inside the estate." "And how does me being bait help you do that?" "Sterling wants you dead," Brill said. "But he wants the drives more. If you show up at his front gate, surrendering, claiming you want to negotiate, he will let you in. He will want to look you in the eye before he kills you. He will want to know where the drives are. And while he's looking at me, I will be moving through the back door," Brill said. Hayes looked at the ground, the damp earth and the dead leaves. She was a woman who had negotiated multi-billion-dollar defense contracts, who had commanded committee hearings and shaped national policy. Now, her life depended on a desperate, suicidal gamble orchestrated by a ghost. She looked up at Brill. She saw the cold, detached certainty in his eyes. He wasn't asking her to be brave. He was asking her to be pragmatic. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice steadying. Brill nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her resolve. "We find a new vehicle," Brill said, turning and walking into the dark woods. "We drive to Virginia. And we prepare for the end." Chapter 16. They stole a 2018 Subaru Outback from the long-term parking lot of a regional airport an hour outside of Chicago. It was unremarkable, reliable, and invisible in the endless stream of suburban traffic. Brill Wingfield drove. Victoria Hayes sat in the passenger seat, staring at the gray ribbon of interstate unfurling before them. The drive east took 14 hours. They stopped only for gas, paying in cash Brill had pulled from a secondary stash in the F-150 before they abandoned it. They ate stale sandwiches and drank bitter coffee. The silence between them was no longer born of shock. It was the quiet, heavy atmosphere of preparation. They crossed into Virginia just after midnight. Brill didn't head straight for Great Falls. He turned the Subaru onto a dark, secondary road in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, navigating toward a location not found on any GPS. "Where are we?" Hayes asked, her voice raspy from exhaustion. "Supply run," Brill said. He pulled the car off the road and down a narrow gravel track that ended at a rusted corrugated metal barn. The structure was surrounded by overgrown weeds and abandoned farm equipment. It looked entirely derelict. Brill killed the engine. He didn't turn on a flashlight. He walked to the heavy sliding door of the barn, found a hidden keypad beneath a loose piece of siding, and entered a 12-digit code. The door slid open with a heavy metallic groan. Inside, the barn was spotless. A single, low-wattage bulb illuminated a reinforced concrete bunker built within the wooden shell. This was one of Brill's primary caches, a blind drop established years ago for precisely this kind of scenario. He unlocked the bunker door. The smell of gun oil and cosmoline drifted into the cool night air. "Stay by the car," Brill ordered. He disappeared into the bunker. When he emerged 10 minutes later, he carried 2 heavy Pelican cases. He loaded them into the back of the Subaru. "What is that?" Hayes asked, watching him secure the cases. "Leverage," Brill replied. He opened the smaller case in the trunk. The foam insert held a matte black rifle, longer and heavier than the Mk-18. It was a customized .300 Winchester Magnum sniper rifle, fitted with a massive variable zoom optic and a suppressed barrel. Beside it lay a specialized ghost gun assault rifle, a weapon built from unmarked, untraceable parts, possessing no serial number and no legal history. He handed her a sleek, compact sidearm, a Sig Sauer P365. "I have the other one," Hayes said, gesturing toward the Glock he had given her in the root cellar. "The Glock is heavy," Brill said. "It pulls your coat down. It makes you look armed. This is lighter. Put it in your pocket. Keep your hand on it." She took the small weapon. It felt cold and foreign in her palm. Brill closed the case. He turned to face her, the dim light from the barn casting harsh shadows across his face. "Director Sterling's estate is located at the end of a private drive in Great Falls," Brill said, transitioning into the briefing. "It is a 10-acre property, backed against the Potomac River. The perimeter is secured by a 10-foot wrought iron fence, motion sensors, and thermal cameras. The grounds are patrolled by elite private security contractors. Ex-military. Heavily armed." "You said I was going to the front gate," she said, her throat dry. "You are," Brill confirmed. "At exactly 0400 hours, you will pull this car up to the main gate. You will exit the vehicle, keeping your hands visible. You will tell the intercom operator your name. You will say you are surrendering, and you have the Barack drives." "Will they shoot me?" "No," Brill said, his voice carrying an absolute terrifying certainty. "Sterling has issued orders to capture you alive. He needs the encryption keys to access the data. He needs to look you in the eye and know he has won. What happens after they let me in?" "They will disarm you," Brill said, pointing to the Sig Sauer. "They will find that weapon. They will pat you down. They will escort you to the main house. Sterling will most likely receive you in his study or a secure room. He will want to conduct the interrogation himself." "And where will you be?" "I will be breaching the rear perimeter," Brill said. "The Potomac River provides a natural blind spot in the thermal grid if approached correctly. I will enter the grounds while the security detail is focused on you at the front gate. You're using me as a distraction, she said, the reality of the plan sinking in. I am using you as a wedge, Brill corrected. A distraction creates noise. A wedge creates an opening. Once inside, I will disable their communications and dismantle the guard force. I will reach you before Sterling realizes the situation has changed. You don't know that, she whispered. You're guessing. I am calculating, Brill said. The variables are tight, but the math supports the execution. He reached into his tactical rig and pulled out the encrypted thumb drive from Chicago. He held it up. Tell Sterling you hid the original drives, Brill instructed. Tell him this is a copy of the root directory. It will buy you time. He will want his technicians to verify it. He handed her the drive. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was cold, like a stone left out in the winter rain. Are you afraid? Hayes asked, looking up into his dark, empty eyes. Fear is irrelevant, Brill said. Only the objective matters. He closed the trunk of the Subaru. We have 2 hours, he said. Get in the car. They left the barn behind, driving the dark, winding roads toward Great Falls. The silence in the car was absolute. Victoria Hayes held the small pistol in her pocket and the encrypted drive in her hand. She was a former United States Senator, a woman of power and influence, driving toward a heavily armed fortress to surrender to a man who wanted her dead. She looked at the ghost sitting beside her, the man who had dragged her into the darkness, the man who had killed without hesitation to keep her alive. She realized she wasn't just relying on his tactical brilliance, she was relying on his utter ruthlessness. They parked the car in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac a mile from the estate. Brill stepped out. He didn't wear a winter coat. He wore a dark, specialized wetsuit underneath his tactical gear. He carried the suppressed Mk-18 and a small waterproof bag containing a rebreather unit. He walked to the driver's window. 0400 hours, Brill said. Do not be early. Do not be late. Hayes nodded, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Good luck, she whispered. Brill didn't reply. He turned away from the car and vanished into the dense woods leading toward the Potomac River, leaving her alone with the ticking clock and the terrifying certainty of the end. Chapter 17. The Potomac River felt like liquid ice. Brill Wingfield moved beneath the surface, kicking in a steady, energy-conserving rhythm. The black neoprene of his wetsuit compressed his chest. The rebreather fed him scrubbed oxygen. No bubbles escaped to mark his path. Total acoustic and visual discipline. He navigated by the faint, ambient glow of the shoreline estates. The current fought him. He angled his body, cutting across the flow, aiming for the massive stone retaining wall that marked the rear boundary of Director Sterling's property. He reached the wall. Smooth, wet granite. He broke the surface. He didn't gasp. He breathed through his nose, slow and shallow. The dashboard clock in the Subaru read 3:59. Victoria Hayes pressed her foot against the brake. The heavy wrought iron gates loomed in the headlights. A guardhouse sat behind the reinforced steel bars, its windows tinted black. The clock clicked to 4 o'clock. Hayes rolled down the window. The cold air bit her face. She pulled the Subaru parallel to the intercom speaker. She put the car in park. She kept both hands resting on the top of the steering wheel. A red light blinked on the intercom panel. A camera lens swiveled, focusing on her face. Static hissed. State your business, a voice demanded. Flat. Professional. My name is Victoria Hayes, she said. Her voice shook. She cleared her throat and forced the steel back into her tone. I have the Barack drives. I want to see Sterling. Silence. 10 seconds passed. Floodlights ignited, blinding her. She squinted, turning her head away from the glare. The heavy iron gates hummed and rolled open. 3 men stepped into the light. They wore dark tactical gear. They carried short-barreled rifles. They didn't point the weapons at her, but they held them at the low ready. Step out of the vehicle, the lead guard said. Keep your hands visible. Hayes opened the door. She stood up on the asphalt. The wind cut through her cashmere sweater. 2 guards flanked her. The third moved to the car, shining a high-powered flashlight into the front and back seats. Empty, the third guard said. The lead guard stepped up to her. Hands on the roof. Spread your feet. Hayes complied. The metal roof of the Subaru froze her palms. The guard patted her down. His hands were rough, efficient. He found the Sig Sauer in her coat pocket. He pulled it out, checked the chamber, and slid it into his own waistband. He patted her other pocket. He pulled out the encrypted thumb drive. He held it up to the floodlights. Is this it? The guard asked. That is a copy of the route directory, Hayes said, repeating Brill's instructions word for word. The original drives are hidden. I only give the location to Sterling. The guard tapped his earpiece. He murmured something too low for her to hear. He nodded. Zip her, the guard ordered. One of the flankers grabbed her wrists, pulling them behind her back. Thick plastic zip ties bit into her skin. They pulled tight with a sharp, ratcheting sound. Walk, the lead guard said. Brill gauged the distance to the top of the retaining wall. 15 feet. He pulled a folding grappling hook from his rig. The tines were wrapped in thick paracord to muffle the sound of impact. He swung it once and threw. The hook cleared the edge and caught. He tested the tension. It held. He climbed, hand over hand, boots pressing flat against the wet granite. He crested the wall and rolled over the edge, dropping flat into the manicured grass of the rear lawn. He lay perfectly still. He detached the rebreather mouthpiece. He drew a slow breath of the cold Virginia air. 50 yards away, the main house dominated the landscape. A sprawling Tudor mansion of brick and timber. Lights burned in the ground floor windows. Between Brill and the house lay an expanse of open lawn. 2 men walked the perimeter. They wore dark coats and carried rifles slung across their chests. They wore night vision optics on their helmets. Brill unsealed his waterproof dry bag. He pulled out the Mk-18 carbine. He locked a magazine into the well. He racked the charging handle. The metallic click vanished in the wind coming off the river. He watched the patrol. They walked a lazy, overlapping pattern. They felt secure behind their walls. They trusted their thermal cameras. The river water shedding off Brill's wet suit masked his thermal signature. The thick neoprene insulated his body heat. To the cameras, he was just another patch of cold ground. The patrol separated. One man turned toward the pool house. The other continued toward the retaining wall. Toward Brill. Brill rose to a crouch. He drew his karambit. A gunshot, even suppressed, carried risk this close to the main structure. The guard stopped 10 feet away. He unslung his rifle, resting the stock on his hip, and reached into his pocket for a pack of cigarettes. He struck a lighter. The sudden flame ruined his night vision for 3 crucial seconds. Brill crossed the distance. He grabbed the guard's collar from behind, yanking him backward off balance. He drove the curved blade of the karambit into the side of the man's neck, severing the carotid artery. He clamped his left hand over the man's mouth, riding the body down to the wet grass. The guard thrashed twice. Blood soaked the manicured lawn. He went still. Brill wiped the blade on the dead man's coat. He sheathed the knife and picked up his MK-18. One down, one moving toward the pool house. They marched Hayes through a set of heavy oak double doors. The interior of the estate smelled of lemon polish, wood smoke, and expensive leather. Oriental rugs muffled their footsteps on the hardwood floors. Oil paintings of hunting dogs and old ships hung on the walls. It looked like a museum. They pushed her down a long corridor and into a vast wood-paneled study. A fire burned in a massive stone hearth. A man sat in a high-backed leather chair near the fire. He wore a tailored suit, despite the hour. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His face was sharp, lined with age and absolute authority. Director Sterling. He looked up from a crystal glass of amber liquid. He studied her. "Victoria," Sterling said. His voice was rich, deep, accustomed to giving orders that shaped nations. "You look tired." "And you look like a traitor, Arthur," Hayes said. Sterling smiled. A cold, barren expression. He gestured to the guard. The guard placed the encrypted thumb drive and the Sig Sauer on a silver tray resting on the desk. "Leave us," Sterling told the guards. The men filed out. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Sterling stood up. He walked to the desk and picked up the thumb drive. "A copy of the route directory," Sterling mused, turning the small piece of plastic over in his fingers. "Clever, but ultimately useless without the encryption keys. Where are the physical drives?" "Safe," Hayes said. She stood straight, fighting the tremble in her knees. "You call off your dogs. You give me a guarantee of safety. Then we talk about the drives." Sterling laughed. A dry, rasping sound. "You misunderstand the dynamic of this room, Victoria," he said. He picked up the Sig Sauer. He checked the chamber, mimicking the guard's earlier action. "You don't negotiate. You are a loose end. You are here because you ran out of places to hide. Where is the operative? The one who burned my Chicago node?" "I don't know," Hayes lied. "We separated in Baltimore." "Disappointing." Sterling walked toward her. He raised the small pistol, pointing it at her chest. "I wanted to look him in the eye before I killed him. But you will do." Brill tracked the second guard. The man stood near the corner of the stone pool house, staring at the glowing screen of a smartphone. Brill didn't use the knife this time. He needed speed. He leveled the MK-18. He aimed for the exposed gap at the base of the skull. Peefed. The suppressed round dropped the guard instantly. The man collapsed onto the flagstone patio, his smartphone clattering against the rock. Brill stepped over the body. He reached the rear facade of the main house. A set of French doors led into a dark sunroom. The doors were locked, wired with magnetic alarm sensors. Brill retrieved a small glass cutter from his rig. He scored a circle in the pane nearest the handle. He applied a suction cup to the glass and tapped the edge of the circle. The glass popped free. He reached through the hole. He bypassed the interior deadbolt. He attached a localized shunt to the alarm sensor wires, feeding the system a continuous loop of clear signals. He opened the door. He stepped into the estate. The air was warm. He left wet footprints on the Persian rugs. He moved through the dark sunroom, his rifle leading the way. He heard voices down the hall. Faint. Muffled by heavy wood. He moved toward the sound. Chapter 18. The sunroom opened into a wide corridor flanked by marble columns. Brill Wingfield moved through the shadows. His wet suit shed water onto the expensive Persian runners. He ignored the damp trail. He wasn't trying to hide his presence anymore. He was managing his reveal. He heard the low industrial hum of the estate's climate control system. He tracked the sound to a heavy steel door set flush into the oak paneling. A utility hub. Brill pushed the door open. The room smelled of ozone and hot copper. Banks of gray breaker panels lined the walls. A massive Kohler automatic transfer switch dominated the center, waiting to kick on the diesel generators if the grid failed. He unspooled a length of thick copper wire from his rig. He bypassed the complex digital interface. He drove his combat knife into the plastic housing of the main data trunk, exposing the fiber optic lines feeding the estate's internal network. He sliced through them. The house was digitally severed. He moved to the transfer switch. He jammed the heavy steel handle of his Torx driver into the mechanical relay, physically locking the arm in place. The generators would not start. Brill reached the main breaker panel. He pulled the master switch down. The low hum of the climate control died. The ambient light spilling from under the doors vanished. The Tudor mansion plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Brill lowered his night vision goggles. The world turned a crisp, monochromatic green. He stepped back into the corridor. At the far end of the hall, a door opened. A guard stepped out, a high-lumen Surefire flashlight mounted to his rifle, cutting a stark white cone through the black air. "Control, we have a total grid failure," the guard said, tapping his earpiece. Silence answered him. "Control, respond," the guard repeated. A note of tension crept into his voice. He swept the flashlight beam across the corridor. The light passed over the wet footprints on the carpet. The guard froze. He lowered the beam, tracing the damp trail toward the utility room. Brill didn't retreat. He pressed his back against the marble column, directly in the guard's path. He drew his karambit. The guard advanced. His boots made soft, measured sounds on the rug. He raised his rifle, the flashlight beam bouncing off the oak walls. He cleared the edge of the column. Brill stepped into his blind spot. He clamped his left hand over the flashlight bezel, plunging the corridor back into darkness, and simultaneously grabbing the weapon's barrel. He twisted hard, wrenching the rifle from the man's grip. As the guard lunged forward to recover it, Brill drove the curved blade of the karambit up under the man's jaw, severing the vocal cords and the jugular vein in one brutal motion. The guard collapsed. Brill caught him under the arms, lowering him silently to the floor. He sheathed the knife. He unspooled a long length of military-grade paracord from his belt. He tied a slipknot around the dead man's ankles. Brill dragged the body down the corridor. He reached the grand foyer. It was a massive space, 3 stories high. A sweeping double staircase curved upward to a wraparound balcony. A massive crystal chandelier hung suspended from a heavy iron winch in the vaulted ceiling. Brill threw the loose end of the paracord over the brass railing of the second-floor balcony. He hauled the line taut. He used his body weight to hoist the dead guard off the marble floor. The body rose into the air, spinning slowly. Brill tied the cord off to a heavy stone pillar at the base of the stairs. The dead man hung suspended 10 feet above the center of the foyer, directly beneath the chandelier. Blood dripped from the severed neck. It hit the polished marble floor with a steady, rhythmic ticking sound. Tick, tick, tick. Brill stepped back into the deep shadows beneath the stairwell. He raised the Mk-18. He waited. A minute passed. Footsteps pounded on the hardwood of the west wing. 2 guards rushed into the foyer. Their weapon lights slashed through the darkness, chaotic and erratic. "Miller. You copy?" the lead guard shouted. Discipline was fraying. The silence on the radio was a localized terror. They swept the ground floor. The lead guard's light caught the puddle of blood on the marble. He stopped. He tracked the beam upward. The light illuminated the dead man, swinging slowly in the void. "Jesus Christ," the guard yelled. He stumbled backward, his rifle dropping a fraction of an inch. The second guard panicked. The psychological pressure of the dark, the dead radios, and the slaughtered point man broke his training. He saw a shadow shift on the second-floor balcony. He didn't verify the target. He pulled the trigger. A deafening burst of 5.56 millimeters fire ripped through the foyer. The rounds missed the balcony entirely. They slammed into the massive crystal chandelier. The glass shattered. Thousands of razor-sharp shards rained down on the foyer like a localized frag grenade. Both guards threw their arms over their faces, diving for the floor as heavy chunks of lead crystal smashed into the marble around them. Brill used the noise. He stepped out from beneath the stairs. He crossed the foyer in 3 long strides. The second guard was on his knees, brushing glass from his helmet. Brill swung the heavy polymer stock of the Mk-18 like a baseball bat. He caught the kneeling man flush in the temple. The helmet deflected some of the blow, but the kinetic transfer snapped the man's neck. He crumpled into the shattered glass. The lead guard heard the impact. He rolled onto his back, raising his rifle. He fired blindly into the dark. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted off the stone pillars. Brill dropped into a slide across the slick marble. He leveled his carbine and fired a single suppressed round. The shot took the lead guard in the center of his chest plate. It didn't penetrate, but the blunt force trauma knocked the wind out of him, freezing his trigger finger. Brill was over him before the man could draw a breath. He stomped down hard on the guard's right wrist. Bones snapped. The rifle clattered away. Brill drove the heel of his boot into the man's throat, crushing the windpipe. The foyer went silent again. The only sound was the crunch of broken crystal under Brill's boots as he stepped away from the bodies. He had dismantled the interior patrol. The remaining exterior guards were locked outside, blind and deaf to the slaughter inside the walls. Brill moved down the east corridor. He passed oil paintings and antique armor stands. He reached a set of heavy, double oak doors. He stopped. He gauged the thickness of the wood. Solid core. Bullet-resistant, but not impenetrable. He heard a voice through the heavy timber. Director Sterling. The tone was sharp, irritated. "Find out why the lights are out," Sterling commanded, his voice muffled but clear. "And get communications back online. Now." Brill reached into his rig. He pulled out a small, specialized shaped charge. He pressed the adhesive backing against the brass lock mechanism of the double doors. He stepped to the side of the doorframe. He held the remote detonator in his left hand, the Mk-18 in his right. Chapter 19. The shaped charge did not explode outward. Designed for precise, localized destruction, the specialized explosive drove a hypervelocity jet of kinetic energy directly through the brass locking mechanism of the double doors. Splintered oak and vaporized metal blasted into the study. The heavy doors blew inward, torn violently from their reinforced hinges, crashing onto the oriental rug in a cloud of pulverized wood and gray smoke. Flowing into the room behind the shockwave, Brill Wingfield kept the Mk-18 carbine pinned to his shoulder. He bypassed the burning wreckage of the doors, his boots crunching over shattered brass. The air inside the study was thick with dust, the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure causing the fire in the massive stone hearth to flare wildly. Director Sterling was no longer sitting in the leather chair. Sweeping the barrel of the rifle across the empty room, Brill evaluated the environment. An overturned crystal glass lay on the mahogany desk, amber liquid soaking into a leather blotter. Behind the desk, a towering section of built-in bookshelves stood ajar, revealing a narrow passageway illuminated by harsh red LED lighting. At the end of the short corridor, a thick steel door was sliding shut on pneumatic tracks. Sterling had not frozen in the face of the breach. A man who had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous currents of global intelligence understood survival. He had grabbed his leverage and retreated to his fortress. Brill crossed the study in 3 long strides, vaulting the mahogany desk. He reached the hidden corridor just as the pneumatic door sealed with a heavy, resonant thud. 6 solid steel locking bolts engaged, dropping into their reinforced concrete housings with the finality of a bank vault closing. Lowering the Mk-18, Brill approached the steel barrier. He ran a gloved hand over the cold, unpainted surface. No keypad. No exposed wiring harness to hack. The panic room was a completely isolated environment, designed to withstand a prolonged siege, chemical attacks, and high-explosive breaching attempts. Standing in the narrow corridor, Brill looked up. A high-capacity ventilation duct ran along the ceiling, supplying scrubbed, filtered air to the sealed room. A heavy iron grate covered the intake, secured by 4 tamper-proof screws. Slinging the rifle across his back, Brill drew his combat knife. He didn't bother with the screws. Slipping the dark steel blade between the iron grate and the dry wall, he applied brutal downward leverage. The dry wall crumbled. The metal frame groaned, bent, and popped free, showering him with white plaster dust. Brill reached into his tactical rig, extracting his final block of C4. He didn't need to destroy the panic room. Attempting to blow a hole in the hardened steel door would only funnel the blast back into the corridor, incinerating him. Instead, he needed to alter the internal pressure. Molding the gray explosive into a tight cylinder, he attached a timed detonator. He pushed the charge deep into the ventilation shaft, angling it downward so it rested directly against the primary intake manifold, sitting just behind the steel door frame. He set the fuse for 10 seconds. Stepping backward out of the hidden corridor, Brill took cover behind the massive stone masonry of the fireplace. He braced himself against the hearth, opening his mouth slightly to equalize the pressure in his inner ears. The detonation was a muffled, concussive crump that shook the foundation of the Tudor mansion. Because the explosive was confined within the heavy steel ductwork of a hermetically sealed room, the expanding gases had nowhere to go. The immense, instantaneous overpressure sought the path of least resistance. It found the pneumatic tracks of the sliding door. With an agonizing shriek of shearing metal, the tracks buckled outward. The heavy steel door blew off its heavy-duty hinges, crashing backward into the panic room in a blinding storm of white drywall dust, shredded insulation, and smoke. Brill stepped out from behind the fireplace. He walked into the hidden corridor, his boots grinding over the debris, the Mk-18 raised to his eye. The interior of the panic room was austere, lined with brushed steel and bathed in emergency crimson light. The air filtration system screamed, trying to clear the thick cloud of smoke hanging in the room. Through the haze, Brill found his targets. Arthur Sterling stood backed against the far wall, his tailored suit coated in a layer of gray dust. He gripped Victoria Hayes tightly around the chest, holding her squarely in front of him as a human shield. The former senator was trembling violently, her eyes wide with shock, her hands clawing uselessly at the man's thick forearm. Pressed hard against her right temple was the barrel of the Sig Sauer P365. "Drop the weapon," Sterling screamed, his rich, authoritative voice cracking under the adrenaline. "Drop the rifle or I blow her head off." Brill did not lower the Mk-18. He stepped over the ruined steel door, advancing 2 paces into the room. He stopped 15 feet away, his stance wide and rooted, the red dot of his optic resting squarely on the sliver of Sterling's forehead visible above Hayes' shoulder. "You think you've won?" Sterling shouted, stepping sideways, dragging the terrified woman with him to keep her between his body and the rifle. "You think breaking in here ends this? Vanguard is an ideology. It's an apparatus. You kill me, and a dozen men step into my place. You are a dead man, operative." Brill remained perfectly still. He breathed in a slow, controlled rhythm. He assessed the geometry of the situation. The Sig Sauer was a double-action weapon. The hammer was already cocked. If he missed the brainstem, if Sterling suffered a mere muscular spasm upon death, the man's finger would clench the trigger. "We can make an arrangement," Sterling offered, his tone shifting rapidly from rage to negotiation, the survival instinct taking over. "You want money? I have offshore accounts. Untraceable. You want a new identity? I control the databases. Leave the woman. Give me the drives. You walk out of here, a ghost, fully funded." Victoria Hayes squeezed her eyes shut. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her face. She waited for the bullet, feeling the cold steel of the pistol digging into her skin, knowing her wealth and political influence meant absolutely nothing in this bloody room. Sterling waited for an answer. He waited for a demand, a counteroffer, a hesitation. He was accustomed to dealing with men who possessed an agenda. He didn't realize he was dealing with a force of nature. Brill did not speak. He did not negotiate. He simply isolated the variable. He tracked the slight, nervous sway of Sterling's body. He waited for the exact fraction of a second when the director's head drifted a centimeter to the left, exposing the orbital bone of his right eye. Brill squeezed the trigger. Peefed. The suppressed round crossed the 15 feet in less than a blink. It slipped past Victoria Hayes's ear, so close the supersonic displacement of air ruffled her hair. The 5.56 mm bullet struck Arthur Sterling perfectly through the right pupil. The kinetic energy of the round rode the optic nerve straight into the medulla oblongata, instantly shutting down the central nervous system. There was no muscular spasm. There was no dying reflex. Sterling's finger went entirely slack against the trigger of the Sig Sauer. His head snapped backward, a dark spray of blood and tissue painting the brushed steel wall behind him. The Director of National Intelligence released his grip. He collapsed backward, hitting the floor like a sack of wet cement. Hayes screamed, a sharp, ragged sound, stumbling forward as the weight supporting her vanished. She dropped to her knees on the steel floor, covering her ears, her entire body shaking as the adrenaline washed out of her system. Brill lowered the Mk-18. He walked slowly across the panic room. He didn't look at the dead man on the floor. He stopped beside the trembling woman, reaching down to pick up the Sig Sauer that had slipped from Sterling's dead hand. He checked the chamber, engaged the safety, and slipped the small weapon into his pocket. Turning his back on the carnage, Brill Wingfield looked toward the ruined doorway, the red emergency lights casting long, bloody shadows across his face. Chapter 20. Blood crept across the brushed steel floor of the panic room, moving with agonizing slowness to pool around the polished black leather of Arthur Sterling's expensive Italian loafers. The metallic tang of fresh death mingled with the harsh chemical bite of vaporized C4 and settling plaster dust. Victoria Hayes remained on her knees. Her breath hitched in her chest, tearing through her throat in ragged, uneven gasps. She stared at the vacant, ruined face of the Director of National Intelligence. 30 years of geopolitical manipulation, limitless black budgets, and whispered boardroom threats had ended in a fraction of a second, leaving nothing but a crumpled heap of tailored wool and cooling flesh. Standing over the body, Brill Wingfield did not offer a hand. He did not speak words of comfort. He checked the action of the captured Sig Sauer, engaged the safety mechanism with a sharp click, and slid the compact weapon into the deep pocket of his dark tactical sweater. "Get up," Brill said. The command held no heat, no urgency. It was a simple statement of the next required action. Hayes looked up at him. The red emergency lighting cast jagged, bloody shadows across the harsh angles of his face. She searched his dark eyes for some flicker of adrenaline, some acknowledgement of the monumental assassination he had just committed. She found a void. He had simply balanced an equation. "He's dead," she whispered, her voice failing to find any resonance in the tight space. "He is," Brill agreed. "And the Fairfax County Police Department is currently responding to a perimeter alarm, tripped by a downed helicopter. We have less than 4 minutes before the main gate is breached. Get up." She forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling so violently she had to brace a hand against the steel wall. The cold metal grounded her. Turning his back on the corpse, Brill stepped over the mangled remains of the pneumatic door. He moved into the hidden corridor, his boots crunching on the debris. Hayes followed, keeping her eyes locked on the broad span of his shoulders, terrified to look back at the room they were leaving. They emerged into the ruined study. The massive stone hearth still flickered, casting a warm, dancing glow over the pulverized oak of the double doors. "Walk behind me," Brill instructed, raising the MK-18 carbine to a low ready position. "Step where I step." Navigating the wreckage of the Tudor mansion required precision. Brill led her out of the study and down the long, dark corridor toward the grand foyer. The silence in the house was profound, heavy with the weight of the slaughtered guard force. Stepping onto the Persian runners, Hayes felt the dampness soaking into the expensive wool. She looked down, expecting water from the river, but the ambient moonlight spilling through the windows revealed dark, slick stains trailing along the baseboards. They reached the edge of the grand foyer. Hayes stopped dead. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. Suspended from the second-floor brass railing, a man in black tactical gear hung 10 feet in the air, slowly rotating on the end of a thick paracord rope. Directly beneath the swinging body, the marble floor was buried under thousands of razor-sharp shards of shattered crystal from the ruined chandelier. Another body lay crumpled within the glittering debris, neck bent at a grotesque, impossible angle. It was a medieval tableau of violence, rendered in marble and lead crystal. "Keep moving," Brill said, barely sparing a glance at the carnage he had orchestrated. He charted a path through the safest edges of the room, avoiding the sweeping arcs of broken glass. Hayes followed, her expensive riding boots crunching softly. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, clamping her jaw shut to keep her teeth from chattering. She had hired a bodyguard. She had received a monster. They reached the sunroom at the rear of the estate. The cold wind, blowing off the Potomac River, whipped through the circular hole Brill had cut in the French doors. Far in the distance, cutting through the silence of the Virginia night, a high-pitched wail rose above the tree line. Sirens. Multiple units moving fast, converging on the private drive. Brill pushed the glass door open. They stepped out onto the flagstone patio. The freezing air hit Hayes like a physical blow, shocking her system, cutting through the thick fog of her trauma. Stopping near the edge of the manicured lawn, Brill turned to face her. He slung the MK-18 carbine over his shoulder. Reaching into the inner pocket of his rig, he extracted a thick black smartphone housed in an armored waterproof case. He held it out. "Take it," he said. Hayes reached out with shaking fingers, taking the heavy device. The screen was dark, completely devoid of identifying logos or carrier markings. "The thumb drive you gave Sterling was a localized decoy," Brill explained, his voice low and steady against the rising wail of the sirens. "This device contains the actual root directory you extracted from the Barack servers, completely unencrypted, merged with the command structure I pulled from the Chicago node. It is entirely offline. No cloud backup. No network tether." She stared at the black rectangle in her palm. It felt heavier than the pistol he had given her in the root cellar. "Vanguard's entire operational history is on that drive," Brill continued. "Bank accounts, political leverage, blackmail material on 24 sitting senators, 3 cabinet members, and the late director of national intelligence. It is the most dangerous object in Washington." "They will come for me," she said, panic returning to her voice. Sterling is dead, but the rest of them, they will know I have it. Let them come, Brill said. She looked at him, completely uncomprehending. You are no longer a target, Brill told her, his dark eyes locking onto hers, forcing her to absorb the tactical reality. A target runs. A target hides in a cellar. You are now the handler. You hold the leash. I don't know how to do that. You learn, Brill said. When the police arrive, you tell them Sterling abducted you. You tell them his private security force went rogue. Let the intelligence community scramble to cover it up. Tomorrow, you contact the men named on that drive. You don't threaten them. You politely inform them that you have absorbed Vanguard's assets. You dictate the new terms of your survival. The sirens grew significantly louder. The shrill, piercing wail bounced off the brick facade of the mansion. The contract, Brill said. Hayes blinked, the sudden shift in topic catching her off guard. What? 200,000 to start, Brill reminded her, the ultimate transactional predator. 5 million upon neutralization of the primary threat. The threat is neutralized. The board is clear. She stared at him. Blue and red lights began to strobe frantically through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the front of the estate. The police were at the gates. Reaching into her coat pocket with her free hand, Hayes pulled out a slim, silver satellite communicator she had kept hidden in the lining of her slacks since Baltimore. She powered it on, her thumb moving over the keypad, entering a complex sequence of authorization codes linking directly to a blind trust in Zurich. She typed in the routing number he had provided during their very first conversation in the dark of her Georgetown bedroom. She entered the sum. $5 million. She pressed execute. A small green light blinked twice on the silver casing, confirming the encrypted transmission. It's done, she said, her voice hollow. She looked at the blood, drying on the sleeves of his tactical sweater. The wire is authorized. You have your money. Brill did not verify the transaction. He didn't need to check a screen. He operated on a brutal, binary code of absolute consequence. If she lied, he would simply return. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, stepping backward off the flagstone patio and onto the frost-covered grass. The darkness of the tree line seemed to reach out for him, welcoming him back into the void. Tires squealed violently in the distance. Heavy engines roared up the private drive. Shouts echoed over the intercom system at the front of the house. Wait, Hayes said, taking a half-step forward. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She gripped the black smartphone tightly against her chest. Where are you going? Away, Brill said. Will I see you again? The question hung in the freezing air, absurd and desperate. She had spent the last 3 days terrified of his capacity for violence, and now, standing on the edge of the slaughterhouse he had created for her, the thought of being left alone was infinitely worse. Brill stopped at the edge of the shadows. He looked at the former senator, a woman who now held enough raw intelligence to topple a government, shivering in a ruined garden. No, Brill said. He turned his back to the estate. He walked into the dark woods leading toward the black waters of the Potomac River, melting into the shadows with absolute silence. By the time the first heavily armed tactical officers kicked open the shattered remnants of the sunroom doors, their flashlights cutting through the dark, he was already gone. The end.